Tonight, we're venturing deep into the haunted heart of Texas, where the land is as vast as its legends, and just as terrifying. From phantom lights drifting along forgotten rivers to ancient forces that should have stayed buried, prepare yourself for 20 disturbing true stories of Texas's most haunted places that will leave you questioning what's real and what's waiting in the shadows. But before we dive in, here's something strange. Most viewers make one huge mistake: they leave without subscribing. And when they do, they miss out on the creepiest, spine-tingling tales that only the bravest dare to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now, because this is only the beginning, and the horrors lurking in the Texas night are far from over. So tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments, because here, the night is only getting started, and the terror is waiting to unfold. The first time I heard about the bridge was at a diner off I-10, one of those places where the coffee tastes like burnt metal, and the waitress calls you honey without even looking up from her notepad. A trucker in a ball cap, grease-worn, into the bill from years of long hauls, was telling a story to a couple of younger drivers. I caught only a few words, something about fog and headlights disappearing mid-air, but it was enough to make me lean in, pretending to study my plate. While I listened, he spoke about a back road in Crockett County, an old farm-to-market route that curved across the Pecos River. He said when the fog rolled in heavy, a bridge would appear, lit just enough for a driver to trust it, and then halfway across, it would vanish, dumping whoever was unlucky enough to be there straight into black water. The younger drivers laughed nervously, the way you laugh when you don't quite believe but don't want to challenge an old hand either. I didn't laugh. I'd been through that part of Texas enough to know the land holds strange things, and the emptiness makes you believe them. I never planned to see the bridge myself, not really. But 2 months later, heading west with a load of machine parts bound for El Paso, I got caught in one of those creeping hill country fogs that spill into the lowlands like smoke. My GPS rerouted me off the interstate due to a wreck ahead, and before long I was winding through roads I didn't recognize, nothing but cedar and mesquite pressing in close on either side. The fog was thick enough that I could barely see 10 feet past my headlights. I slowed to 30, then 20, my knuckles white on the wheel. That's when the road dipped, and through the fog I saw it, the outline of a bridge, pale gray steel rails stretching across a dark void. My headlights caught the signpost, FM something, the number blurred by age and weather, and then the first planks of the bridge itself, wet and gleaming. There was no reason to be afraid. Bridges crisscross this state in every direction, over dry creek beds and swollen rivers alike. But as my tires hit the wood, I felt something hollow open in my chest, a deep instinct that whispered not to go any further. My rig vibrated differently on the boards, not just the usual rattle of tires on old timber, but something deeper, almost as if the truck itself knew. I told myself it was just the fog and the story I'd overheard at the diner. But halfway across, the guardrail to my right flickered, not like a light going out, but like the rail itself wasn't quite there. I blinked hard, leaned forward over the wheel, and that's when I saw it. The far end of the bridge dissolving into fog, not fading naturally, but tearing apart piece by piece, like mist burning off under a morning sun. Except it was midnight, and the fog was getting thicker, not thinner. My instinct screamed to stop, but stopping meant my rig could jackknife or worse, slide sideways into the dark water I could now hear rushing below. I pressed the accelerator, praying the boards would hold, and for a moment the headlights caught nothing but fog. The road was gone. There was no more bridge, no more rails, no more planks. Just air. My stomach dropped like the bottom had fallen. Out of the world, and then, sudden brutal, I hit asphalt. My rig slammed down onto solid pavement, bouncing so hard my teeth rattled. Behind me in the mirror, there was no bridge at all. Just fog curling back over a bare stretch of black water glinting faintly below. My heart hammered so loud I could hear it over the engine, and my hands shook so bad I nearly lost control of the wheel. I pulled off to the shoulder, killed the engine, and sat there breathing in the smell of overheated brakes and the copper tang of my own fear. The next morning, under the hard Texas sun, I went back. Curiosity is a curse that way. The river was low, sluggish under the wide sky, and there was no bridge, not even ruins of one. Just a pair of broken pylons half sunk in mud, old concrete eaten away by time. Locals I asked later said the bridge had washed out in the 70s after a flash flood, never rebuilt because the county rerouted the road. But they all knew the story. They said sometimes when the fog rises off the Pecos just right, the bridge shows itself to travelers who don't know better, leading them straight to where it used to stand. Some don't come back. A rancher told me he'd pulled a sedan out of the river last spring. Driver drowned inside, headlights still glowing underwater when they found it. He probably thought the bridge was real, the man said, spitting tobacco into the dust. They always do. I told myself I'd imagined it, that maybe the fog and fatigue had played tricks on me. But 2 weeks later, in El Paso, another driver cornered me outside a truck stop and asked if I'd ever run FM 2397. "Saw you listed on the reroute logs that night," he said, eyes wide and haunted. "You make it across?" He leaned in before I could answer, voice low. "I followed your taillights onto that bridge. 1 second you were there, next second you were gone. If I hadn't hit the brakes when I did, I'd be in the Pecos right now. I don't take detours through Crockett County anymore. I don't reroute even when the interstate shuts down. I'd rather sit in traffic for hours than risk seeing that fog roll in again. Because now I know the truth. Some bridges in Texas don't lead where you think they do. Some of them are waiting, patient and silent, to open up under your wheels and drag you down into the dark water where the headlights still shine, far beneath the surface, marking the place where the living met the dead. The Red Barn Diner sat by the old highway west of Lubbock, long abandoned. Its once bright paint faded into a dull scarlet that looked more like dried blood than cheerful Americana. The letters of its neon sign had long since gone dark, but you could still make them out when the moonlight hit right, spelling Red Barn in broken glass tubes. Every rancher and trucker who still drove that lonely stretch of road at night knew the stories, but most kept them quiet, the way small towns bury their darkest gossip under layers of silence. They said if you passed by at 3 a.m, when the wind was still and the sky seemed to hold its breath, you could hear silverware clinking on plates, faint laughter, the murmur of conversations that shouldn't exist anymore. Worse, sometimes an old jukebox inside would start up on its own, pushing out some warbled country song through the boarded windows. Though the diner had been gutted decades ago, I was 23 when I found myself out there, not by choice but by circumstance. I had been driving back from Amarillo after visiting an uncle, my old Ford coughing and sputtering with every mile. Somewhere along the endless flat highway, the damn thing gave out. I pulled over, tried to flag down help, but at that hour the road was empty. Nothing but the hum of crickets and the distant yip of coyotes. The closest glow of civilization was a faint, rusty red outline against the horizon, and when I walked toward it, I realized it was the diner. Everyone in Lubbock had heard of the Red Barn, though most dismissed it as campfire talk, something kids dared each other about. I remembered hearing whispers when I was a boy, how a family disappeared there one winter night in the 70s, how the cook had supposedly hung himself in the freezer, how a waitress was found out back with her, throat slit. No one ever confirmed those stories, but the building had closed overnight and nobody ever bought the land after. It just sat there, weathered and waiting. The boards nailed over the windows were warped and loose, and when I got close, I swear, I caught the faintest sound of something shifting inside, like a chair leg dragging across tile. My first thought was squatters. My second was that my ears were playing tricks. But then it came again, faint and deliberate, followed by what could only be the metallic clink of cutlery. The air was cool that night, a late autumn wind sweeping across the flatland, carrying with it that dry, dusty smell of mesquite and wheat. I told myself I was only curious, but the truth was darker. I wanted to know. I'd grown up on stories about that place, and standing there in the stillness, the silence pressing in except for those impossible sounds, something in me couldn't turn away. I walked around to the back, where an old door hung crooked on one hinge. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, the wood swollen and gray, the paint peeled into scales. My flashlight beam caught on rusted nails, shattered glass, a nest of spiders curled in the corner. I gave the door a push and it opened with a groan that seemed too loud for the night. Inside smelled of mold and dust with an undercurrent of something sour, like old grease that had seeped too deep into the walls to ever fade. The booths were still there, though torn and slashed, their vinyl split open like wounds. Tables stood at odd angles, covered in a film of grime thick enough to write your name in. But the strangest thing was that a few of them weren't empty. One booth, near the middle, had a plate sitting dead center, a fork and knife laid neatly, on either side. The plate wasn't clean. It had streaks on it, faint lines of something dried and crusted. At first I thought maybe an animal had dragged it there, but the arrangement was too neat, too deliberate. Another table had an upturned glass, dust clinging to its rim. And on the counter near the register sat a stack of plates, clean enough that the flashlight's beam bounced off them in a dull reflection. I froze there, breathing shallow, the beam of my light trembling just enough to make shadows crawl across the walls. And then the jukebox coughed to life. I damn near dropped the flashlight. The sound was faint at first, static and warble, like a record spinning on a bad needle. Then a song emerged, something old and twangy, a country ballad I half recognized from my father's records. The voice of the singer filled the diner, muffled but steady, as though the machine had never died, as though it had been waiting for me. I should have run right then. Any sane person would have. But instead, I stepped deeper inside, drawn to the sound, caught between terror and a strange pull that tightened around my chest like a hand. That's when I noticed the silverware. It wasn't just clinking. It was moving. From the corner booth came the unmistakable scrape of a fork on ceramic, followed by the rhythmic sound of a knife cutting through something soft. My light swung there, and the booth was empty. No one sitting in the cracked vinyl seats, no hands on the table. But the fork lifted on its own, scraped against the plate, then lowered again with a deliberate precision that made my stomach turn cold. The hair on my arm stood up. I backed toward the door, every step slow, my flashlight beam jerking around the room, and that's when I saw them. Reflections in the windows. Not mine, but faces. Dozens of them, pale and hollow-eyed, staring in at me from the darkness outside. Their features were blurred, like steam had fogged the glass. But the eyes, black pits that locked onto me, were clear. I bolted. The door slammed behind me so hard the frame shook, though I hadn't touched it. I stumbled into the night air, gasping, the jukebox still playing muffled behind the boards. The highway was empty as far as I could see. No headlights, no sound of engines, only the endless flat dark. When I looked back, the diner's windows glowed faintly from within, not with the weak beam of my flashlight, but with the soft, warm light of a place still alive. For one terrible moment, I saw figures moving inside. Silhouettes bending over tables, a waitress walking between booths with a tray, a cook standing behind the counter with a cleaver in hand. Then it all went dark. By the time a passing truck slowed to help me, the diner was silent again, boarded and broken, just another ruin on the roadside. I never told the driver what I saw, only asked for a lift back to town. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I still hear that jukebox in my dreams warbling out through the static, and the sound of silverware tapping steady as a heartbeat. And when I drive past that stretch of highway, no matter the hour, I keep my eyes straight ahead and my windows rolled tight, because I know the faces are still pressed to the glass, watching, waiting for someone else curious or foolish enough to stop. The Panhandle highways are long, flat stretches of blacktop where the horizon swallows you whole. And west of Amarillo, the land opens up into nothing but sky and wind. Folks around there call it Dead Horse Curve. It doesn't look like much in daylight, just another sharp bend on FM 1061 where the asphalt seems to lurch away from itself, like the engineers ran out of patience and carved a half moon through the scrub. But at night, under those endless Texas skies, it feels wrong. The air cools too fast, shadows bend where they shouldn't, And there's that peculiar silence you only get when the wind dies suddenly, as if something heavy has sat down on the world. I had heard the stories long before I ever drove it myself. A riderless horse, they said, running out of the mesquite and alongside your car, hooves that make no sound but shake the wheel in your hands, eyes rolling white in the dark. Some people said it was just a trick of headlights catching pronghorn, or a Mustang that roamed the flats. But the wrecks stacked up out there, enough that the sheriff's department put up extra reflective signs, angled them so high beams wouldn't blind drivers, even painted rumble strips on the approach. Didn't matter. Every year, 2 or 3 more crosses went up on the roadside, wooden ones hammered into the clay by families who cried as the dust blew into their eyes. I came through, Dead Horse Curve in September, late at night after driving all the way up from Lubbock. I'd been working odd jobs, picking up shifts at an equipment rental place, and I was dead tired. The 2-lane was empty, just my old Chevy truck rattling like loose bones across the prairie. I had the radio tuned low, some AM station carrying, crackled gospel, and the dash lights painted everything in a sickly green. I knew about the stories, but I wasn't thinking about them until the bend rose ahead of me, blacker than the sky behind it. My brights caught the reflective arrows, 3 of them stacked like warnings. The wheel tugged in my hands as the road sloped sharper than it looked, and I eased off the gas. That's when I saw it. It came out from the right side, just beyond, the bar ditch sudden as a breath. A horse, black or maybe brown, I couldn't tell in the weak glow of my headlights, but big, rangy, its mane whipping. No rider. Its legs stretched wide, pounding air, but there was no sound, not even the clatter of hooves on dirt. It wasn't in the road, not quite, but running even with me, its head jerking, eyes wide and white like coins flashing. I gripped the wheel, heart hammering, and for a moment I thought it was going to cut me off. Then my truck hit the apex of the curve, tires squealing, and I had to throw my weight to keep from sliding. When I looked again, the horse was gone. Nothing but open night, brush still as stone, sky heavy and starless. I didn't remember breathing again until the road straightened out, and I saw the distant glow of Amarillo's lights flickering like embers in the distance. The first thing I did was pull off at a gas station just outside of town. One of those all-night places with buzzing fluorescents and an old man reading a paper behind bulletproof glass. I got out, legs shaky, and walked around the truck as if I'd find some dent, some mark to prove it wasn't just exhaustion making me see things. But there was nothing, just a smear of bugs on the bumper and the lingering smell of dust. I went inside, bought a coffee I didn't even drink, and when I mentioned Dead Horse Curve, the man didn't look up from his paper. He only said, "Count yourself lucky." His voice was dry, flat as the land outside. It ate at me, though. That silence when the horse appeared, the way the world seemed to shrink to just me, the road, and it. A week later, I asked around. People knew the stories. Some said it was the ghost of a rancher's horse, killed in a wreck back in the 50s when a cattle truck overturned there. Others swore it went further back to the Comanche raids, that a warrior had been thrown from his mount on that very bend and both rider and animal had been left to rot in the sun. Everyone had a version, but the details didn't matter. What mattered was how often it happened. Nobody liked driving that road after dark. Nobody who'd seen the horse walked away without telling it in a voice that quivered. And most of them admitted something strange. The horse wasn't just there, it wanted you to look at it, it wanted your eyes on it, so you forgot about the road. That's why the crashes kept happening. I didn't go back for months, but eventually I had to. It was winter by then, January, one of those nights when the panhandle wind cuts like a razor and your breath hangs white in the cab. I told myself I'd take it slow, keep my eyes on the asphalt no matter what. The curve rose out of the dark like before, signs gleaming, arrows screaming, turn. I dropped to 30, gripped the wheel. My headlights stretched over the ditch. At first nothing, just the brush rattling. Then it was there again. Same horse, pounding, head twisting, white eyes rolling. I forced myself not to look. I kept my gaze locked on the center line, muscles screaming as I guided the Chevy through. The horse surged ahead, then fell back as if trying to draw me. The silence closed in. my ears filled with the sound of my own heartbeat. When the road straightened, I dared a glance. Gone again. But something new waited on the roadside this time. A fresh cross, wood bright and raw with flowers laid at its base. Snow dusted the petals already half dead. I didn't stop. I couldn't. What haunted me most wasn't the horse itself. It was the sense that it was aware, not just an echo or a memory, but something that knew when headlights approached, something that waited for eyes to catch it. And each time someone gave in, even for a second, the road claimed them. Amarillo papers ran another accident story that spring. Young couple, pickup full of groceries, lost control at the curve. Skid marks showed they'd swerved hard. No alcohol, no weather. The deputy quoted in the article said, "Probably saw a deer. But I knew better. Everyone out here does." That's why folks cross themselves when they pass that stretch. Why truckers floor it to get through before the dark can settle. I don't drive that way anymore. I'd rather add 30 minutes going around than feel that silence again. But sometimes I dream it. The curve rises out of the night, the horse breaks from the ditch, and it doesn't just run alongside this time. It cuts across the road, eyes fixed on mine, and I know in the dream what will happen when I wrench the wheel. The ditch, the roll, the final stillness. And in the last second, as glass rains down and steel folds, the horse is there, standing, calm now, riderless but waiting, like it's been waiting forever. And I wake up with my hands gripping sheets the way they once gripped a steering wheel, breath coming hard, the silence still heavy in the room. Out there, west of Amarillo, that silence still waits, curve after curve, night after night. I first heard about the church when I was a kid, riding in the back of my uncle's pickup along one of those winding farm-to-market roads outside Palestine. The grown-ups talked low, in that careful way people do when they don't want kids catching on, but I caught enough to know something about a fire and hymns that wouldn't stop. I was too young then to understand, but the name stuck with me. The burned church. Years later, when I was 23 and back home after a stint working oil rigs in East Texas, I found myself driving that same stretch of road one late evening. Summer heat had left the asphalt breathing waves, and the cicadas were just giving way to the crickets. I pulled over where the tree line broke and saw it for the first time, crouched in a clearing like a skeleton that had forgotten to lie down. The roof was gone, burned away decades earlier, but blackened beams jutted into the sky like ribs. The brick walls still stood, scorched and bowed, the windows just open sockets. Even from the road, I thought I saw a faint shimmer inside, like light bending in a heat mirage. The people in town said the ashes never fully cooled, that even in winter, if you walked across the cracked tile floor, you'd smell smoke and sometimes feel warmth rise up through your boots. They also said the locals stopped burying their dead near there because the soil turned them wrong, restless. I didn't believe in that kind of talk. Not then. A week later, I went back on purpose. I parked under the pines with my old flashlight, a cheap thing with a weak beam, and walked the quarter-mile down the dirt track that led into the clearing. The crickets cut off when I stepped into the open, like someone hit a switch. I told myself it was coincidence, but the silence pressed, and too thick for coincidence. The place smelled of wet earth and something else sharp and metallic like blood left too long in a tin can. When I stepped through the wide double doorway, I felt a pocket of warmth rush against me, though the night air outside had been cooling. The floor was layered with ash, but when I bent down and rubbed it between my fingers, it was warm. Not hot, enough to burn, just unsettling like coals left hidden under dirt. A breeze moved through, though there was no roof to guide it, and I swear the sound carried notes. Not a whistle, not wind, notes, a hymn. My mother had taken me to a Baptist church when I was young, and I knew the cadence of those old hymns by heart. But this was wrong. It was stretched and bent, like hearing someone sing while playing the recording backward. I stood frozen, telling myself it was only the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound wasn't moving with the breeze. It was circling me like a congregation unseen, keeping time with steps I couldn't hear. I backed out, stumbled over the threshold and didn't stop until I was halfway down the dirt track. When I finally looked back, the church sat quiet in the clearing. Only the trees shifted with the night wind. I tried to laugh it off, but I didn't go back again for months. It was late autumn when I returned, against my better judgment. My cousin had come to visit from Houston, and I told him the story. He laughed, called me full of it, so I agreed to take him. We brought a 6-pack, flashlights, and a pack of smokes. The cold had set in, real East Texas cold that makes your breath hang long in the air. But when we stepped into the clearing, it was warmer. Not much, but noticeable. My cousin brushed it off as body heat and nerves, but when we pushed through the doorway, the air pressed heavy. It was thick with a smoky sweetness, like burned pine sap. We sat on the old altar steps, drinking, talking low. The ash floor shifted under our boots. My cousin said it was nothing but settlers' gossip, a way to scare kids from trespassing. But then the sound came again, low, rising, almost under the floor. This time, no mistake, it was singing. Clearer now, but twisted backward, the words garbled but keeping rhythm. My cousin froze mid-sentence. He looked at me, his smirk gone. We both held still, waiting for it to stop. Instead, it grew louder, not from the walls or the empty air, but up through the tile beneath us like the earth itself was singing. Then came the heat. The tiles under our boots grew warm, then hot. Too hot. We jumped up, stumbling back toward the doorway. My cousin cursed, kicked at the ash, and when his boot struck, sparks scattered bright orange in the dark, though there was no flame. The singing swelled, and for a second I swear I heard voices layered over each other. Men, women, children, chanting in reverse harmony. My cousin bolted, sprinted down the track. I wasn't far behind. When we finally made it back to the truck, gasping, our faces streaked with sweat despite the 40-degree air, he slammed the door shut and just sat there staring at me. Neither of us spoke until we were back in town. He never mentioned it again. He refused. If I brought it up, he'd get red-faced and quiet like I'd touched a raw nerve. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I asked around, careful not to sound too interested, and one of the older men at a diner told me the real story. The church had burned in 1932, lightning strike during a Wednesday night service. The roof collapsed, killing nearly everyone inside. The few who survived swore the preacher had kept singing through the smoke, urging the congregation not to leave. That fire was God's test. They said the hymns turned strange in the firelight, words warped, like another voice was speaking through him. By the time the fire took the roof, those inside were too lost in song to run. The county sheriff back then had the place condemned, tried to bulldoze it, but the machines broke down one after another. The crew refused to go back. Since then, the land sat abandoned, passed through a handful of owners who never built. They couldn't. Folks said anyone who tried woke to the sound of singing in their own homes. Songs played backward until they left. Some stayed long enough to go half mad. Most didn't. The last time I went was a year ago. I'd been drinking heavy and got it in my head to prove to myself it was nothing. I drove out past midnight, parked the truck, and walked in alone. No flashlight this time. Moonlight spilled across the clearing, turning the walls silver and black. The moment I stepped inside, the floor shivered, like the ash was breathing. I tried to hold steady, told myself to stand firm. But then the heat surged up through my boots again, and the voices came, louder than ever all around me, rising and falling like waves. And this time I understood some of the words. Not all, but enough. My name. They sang my name. Clear as a bell, buried in the backward hymn. The ash stirred in spirals across the floor, glowing faint like embers. I backed out, stumbling into the night, and when I turned to look, I saw shapes standing inside. Rows of them. Dark silhouettes swaying where the pews once stood, shoulders rocking in rhythm. And the hymns went on, even after I ran to the truck, even after I sped off down the road. I can still hear it sometimes when the night is quiet. That backward singing, stretched and wrong, and always my name woven in. Folks in town say the ashes glow at night, that you can see them from the road if you know when to look. I don't drive out that way anymore, but the sound doesn't leave. Once you've heard it, the burned church remembers, and it calls you back. Highway 59 cuts through East Texas like a scar, running past pine thickets and little towns where the gas stations all seem to close before midnight. If you drive it often enough, you start to notice things. I was running loads between Nacogdoches and Houston back in the late 90s, a lot of night driving, and that's when I first saw it. The glowing red vacancy sign, half obscured by trees, with the kind of faint neon buzz you could almost hear through your windshield. It was nothing unusual at first, just another run-down roadside motel, I thought. And I made a mental note of it because I'd been driving long hours and wanted to remember the stop in case I needed a place to sleep on the way back. Only when I checked my map later, there wasn't supposed to be any motel there. Just a stretch of timberland, a couple of dirt turnoffs, nothing more. On my next haul down that way, I kept an eye out for it. Sure enough, a few miles south of Lufkin, there it was again, glowing against the dark line of pines. The letters vacancy burned steady in red, but the rest of the sign, the hollow motel, flickered on and off like the power was bad. I slowed down a little, thinking maybe I'd pull in, but something about the whole thing struck me wrong. The parking lot looked empty. Not just empty, but abandoned, weeds pushing up through the asphalt, the roofline sagging in on itself. I caught sight of the front office as I passed, windows black and broken, and I told myself maybe it had shut down recently. Maybe squatters had wired up the sign. That explanation stuck until I mentioned it a few weeks later to a dispatcher I knew, an older guy who'd been on the road 30 years. He just gave me a look and said, "That place burned down back in '83. Whole family inside, owners and 2 kids. Ain't been nothing there since but a concrete slab and some ashes." I laughed it off, but the way he said it stuck with me. That night, after I'd dropped my load, I asked around at a diner in Livingston, and one of the waitresses, an older woman with hair like steel wool, told me the same thing. The hollow motel went up in flames, nobody made it out, and the county never rebuilt. She said kids sometimes went out there to drink and dared each other to step inside the blackened foundation, but most folks kept clear. I should have left it, alone. But you spend enough nights on the road and you start chasing the strange things, if only to break up the monotony. One night I got off early, figured I'd finally take the turnoff. The sign was glowing again, just like always, like it was waiting for me. I slowed down and took the gravel drive. The sound of it crunching under my tires felt too loud, too sharp, like I was pulling into someplace I didn't belong. Up close, the motel looked impossible. The office door stood open, swinging a little in the breeze, and the row of rooms stretched back into the trees, every door shut and painted the same peeling green. The vacancy sign buzzed, casting the lot in a faint, bloody glow. I killed the engine, but I kept my lights on. Through the windshield, the place looked solid, real. But when I stepped out of the truck, the air changed. It was colder than the highway had been, heavy with a smell I couldn't quite place, something like old wood smoke and mildew. The cicadas had gone silent. I walked up to the office, my boots crunching over gravel and weeds. Inside, there was a counter, a rack of keys on the wall, and a rotary phone sitting in the corner. Everything looked like it had been frozen in time around 1980. Dust thick enough to write in, brochures curling on a rack by the door. I leaned over the counter and saw the registration book lying open, a pen still attached by a chain. The last entry was dated July 1983. The handwriting was neat, a family from Beaumont. I touched the page and the paper felt brittle, like it would crumble if I pressed too hard. That's when I heard it. A soft creak, like a door opening down the row of rooms. I stepped back outside, and sure enough, one of the green-painted doors was ajar. Light spilled out, yellow and warm, flickering like it came from an old lamp. I called out, "Hello?" My voice carried too far, echoing in the trees, and the sound of it made the hair on my arms stand up. No answer came, just the faint murmur of a television set, tinny and indistinct. I should have left, but I didn't. I walked toward the open door. The closer I got, the stranger it felt. The gravel underfoot gave way to cracked pavement, then to carpet, though I couldn't remember stepping inside. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and something sweeter, like burned sugar. A lamp glowed on the nightstand, and an old Zenith TV played static. On the bed sat a little girl in a faded nightgown swinging her legs. She turned her head toward me, and for a moment I saw her face clear as day. Freckles, dark eyes, a shy half smile. Then it flickered, like a film reel jumping, and her features melted into smoke. The next blink she was gone, the bedspread scorched and blackened. The static from the TV grew louder, filling my ears, and in the noise I could make out voices low and frantic. A woman crying, a man shouting, children screaming. Heat pressed against me, though no fire burned. My chest tightened and I couldn't breathe. I stumbled back out into the night air, but the motel didn't let me go so easy. Every door along the row swung open at once, slamming against the walls. Light flared inside each room, then dimmed, then flared again as if the place was caught in its own endless burning. I ran for my truck, the gravel drive stretching longer than it had any right to. My headlights looked dim, as if the air itself was swallowing the light. The vacancy sign buzzed louder, pulsing with each beat of my heart. I threw myself behind the wheel, cranked the ignition, and the truck roared to life. I didn't look back until I hit the highway. When I did, the trees stood unbroken. No sign of a drive, no glowing sign. Just dark woods swallowing the shoulder. Told myself I'd imagined it, that fatigue had played tricks on me. But a week later at another diner, a kid bussing tables overheard me mention Highway 59 and asked if I'd seen the hollow. He said sometimes you catch the sign when you're tired enough, that it only shows itself to folks running on empty. If you see it again, he said, lowering his voice like he was passing a secret, don't stop. Once you step inside, it remembers you. That was over 20 years ago. I still drive 59 sometimes, though never at night if I can help it. And every so often, just past Lufkin, I catch a flicker of red through the trees. The sign is always waiting, buzzing faintly in the dark, promising a place to rest. I keep my eyes forward now, both hands on the wheel, because I know if I pull over again, I might not come back out. The Hollow Motel burned to the ground in 1983, but for some of us, it never stopped checking in guests. And once it's got your name in the book, it never forgets. The Devil's Backbone is one of those places that doesn't need help being eerie. The stretch of limestone ridges that cuts across Blanco County looks like a pile of old bones under the right kind of moonlight, jagged and pale. And folks who grew up around there will tell you without hesitation that it's haunted ground. I didn't put much stock in that when I was younger, but I knew enough to recognize a place where the land itself felt wrong, where the silence seemed too thick, and shadows didn't settle where they should. The lookout on one of the back roads, tucked between Cedar Breaks and Mesquite, had its own reputation. People called it a lover's point, where kids from Blanco or Wimberley would drive out on a warm night, park under the open sky, and watch the stars burn holes through the dark. But for just as many years, there had been talk of couples leaving in a panic, tires spitting gravel, because something had come out of those cedar tangles after them. It was late summer, the night I went there with Claire, hot enough that the heat still rose in waves off the gravel even after sundown. The air smelled of cedar and dry earth, sharp and restless. The crickets had a steady song going, and somewhere down below the ridge I could hear coyotes calling to one another. We had a blanket in the back seat, a six-pack we hadn't touched, yet and no real reason to be out there except that we were young, stupid, and restless. Claire leaned against the hood, tilting her head back to look at the stars. I'd seen plenty of Texas skies, but out there they looked close enough to touch, like somebody had spilled salt all over a black tablecloth. Should have been beautiful. It was for a few minutes. Then the night shifted. It started with the brush. There's always a breeze on the backbone, even on the hottest nights, but this was different. The cedar started to shiver in patches like something heavy was moving through it, brushing against the branches. I froze, thinking it was maybe a deer or even a feral hog rooting around. But the sound was steady, purposeful, circling. Claire noticed too. She put her hand on my arm, fingers tight. "You hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, trying to look casual, but my stomach had already nodded. The noise stopped for a moment, dead still, and then we both saw it. 2 points of light low to the ground in the dark brush. At first I thought it was the reflection of the truck's headlights, but they were off. The glow was coming from within. The eyes blinked, then another set appeared just to the left of it and another behind that. 3 pairs watching us from the cedar. Claire let out a little gasp, more like a hiccup, and I remember the way the sound seemed too loud in that empty night. I hissed for her to get in the truck, but she stood there frozen. The eyes shifted, gliding closer without a sound, the brush barely stirring. I could see the pale outline of something long, the suggestion of a body that didn't quite match. The animal shapes I knew. Not a coyote, not a deer. The eyes glowed brighter as they drew near, not reflecting but emitting light, the way embers glow in a fire pit. That was enough to snap Claire out of it. She bolted for the passenger door, and I was right behind her. By the time I jammed the keys in the ignition, the things had come to the edge of the brush, close enough that I could see shapes slinking forward on 2 long limbs. I floored it, gravel popping under the tires, and the truck fishtailed before, catching traction and roaring down that back road. The worst part was in the mirror. Claire had her hands clamped over her mouth, her eyes huge, but I couldn't stop glancing back. At first I thought we'd left them behind. Then the eyes appeared, again in the dust cloud. A line of them darting between the road and the cedar stands, keeping pace with the truck. They didn't make a sound. No panting like an animal, no snapping branches. Just the steady, silent pursuit, glowing eyes weaving through the dark like fireflies chasing us. I pushed the truck harder, the engine whining, and we didn't stop until we hit the highway, lights in all miles from the backbone. Claire refused to talk about it afterward. She wouldn't even let me mention it when we drove past the area weeks later. She just went quiet and pale, staring hard out the window until we were miles clear. A year later, she was gone from my life altogether, moved to Houston, married a guy she worked with. I can't blame her for cutting ties. Some things you just don't want to carry with you, and what happened out there on the backbone was one of them. I went back once, years later, not with a date but alone, curious or maybe just stubborn. I parked in the same spot, left the truck idling this time, and waited. The night was hot and still again, cicadas screaming from the tree line. The cedar shifted, slow and deliberate. I caught the first flicker of pale eyes and didn't stick around for the second. I gunned it, tires spitting gravel, and when I checked the mirror, I swear I saw the same line of glowing eyes pacing me, unblinking, patient as ever. They weren't hunting in the way coyotes hunt. They were herding, pushing me out, making sure I didn't linger. And I didn't. You can tell yourself it's just stories, that people scare themselves out there because they want to, because the backbone already feels haunted enough without glowing eyes in the brush. But I know better. I've seen them. The land doesn't want us there after dark. Not in that place. Not under that sky. So if you ever find yourself in Blanco County on a hot summer night and someone suggests parking at the lookout to watch the stars, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Because the stars aren't the only things watching from the dark, and the eyes that follow you don't blink, don't breathe, don't stop, and they'll chase you down every back road until you leave their ridge behind. The highway that runs through Raymondville has a way of swallowing you up if you aren't careful. It stretches flat and endless, with mesquite trees crouched low against the wind and barbed wire fences running alongside it for miles at a time. At night, that stretch of South Texas turns into a kind of black void, where the only sound is your own tires humming against the asphalt, and the only light is the glow from your dashboard. I was driving through there last summer, cutting down from Corpus toward Brownsville to see a buddy I hadn't caught up with in years. It was late, later than I should have been out, but I'd lingered at a bar too long, and when I finally hit the road, it was close to midnight. By the time I reached that barren stretch near Raymondville, my fuel gauge was dropping lower than I liked. That's when the GPS pinged and offered me a route to a nearby gas station. The name came up on the screen as Last Stop Gas and Service, and I remember thinking it sounded like some cheap horror movie title. But I didn't have much of a choice. The arrow pointed me off the highway onto a smaller county road. As soon as I took the exit, my headlights washed over dust and scrub brush. There was nothing out there but silence and shadows. No other cars, no houses, no neon lights. I drove another 5 minutes before a low building appeared in the dark, washed pale by the artificial glow of fluorescent tubes. It was a squat concrete block of a gas station, maybe built in the 70s. A single sign hung crooked on a rusted pole with faded red letters spelling "Last Stop." The lights above the pumps buzzed faintly, insects flitting in their halos. I felt a wave of relief seeing it there, but it was mixed with something else, a prickling unease that I tried to push down. The station looked out of time, too clean in some ways, too forgotten in others. I pulled up to one of the pumps and got out. The night was thick and hot, with the kind of humidity that clings to your clothes and makes every breath feel heavy. The cicadas had gone silent. That was the first thing I noticed. South Texas at night should be alive with their rattling chorus, but standing there, all I heard was the faint buzz of the lights. I slid my card into the machine. It spat it back out with a metallic click. I tried again, same thing. No C cashier message, no error code, just the same refusal. I looked toward the station office. Behind the smudged glass of the door, I could see a man at the counter. He was tall, rail-thin, dressed in a collared shirt that looked too big for him. His head was tilted slightly forward as though he'd been waiting for me. I walked in, the bell above the door jingling. The air inside smelled faintly of ammonia and something sweet underneath, like antifreeze. "Pump's not taking my card," I said. The man raised his head slowly. His skin was sallow, stretched tight over his cheekbones, and his hair was combed flat to his skull. His eyes were wide and fixed on me. They didn't blink. Not once. He smiled thinly and said, "Cash only." His voice was low and dry, like it hadn't been used much. I hesitated, my wallet already in hand, and handed him a 20. He reached out with a hand that felt colder than it should have in that heat. He slid the bill into a drawer without looking at it and then nodded. "Pump 3. You're good." He didn't stop staring at me. I filled my tank, trying not to glance at the windows where I knew he was still standing. I could feel it, that unbroken gaze. The pump clicked off and I hurried back into the car. When I looked up at the office, window! The man was closer now, pressed to the glass, his face pale in the glow, eyes still wide and unblinking. My stomach dropped and I started the engine. I didn't even check my receipt. I pulled out onto the road and followed the GPS back toward the highway. But the turn didn't take me where I expected. The narrow asphalt lane twisted and dipped, lined with barbed wire and thorn brush on both sides. My headlights reached only a short stretch ahead, and beyond it was endless black. The GPS arrow kept urging me forward. After 10 minutes, my gut told me something was wrong. I should have been back on the interstate by then. Instead, the road narrowed to gravel, then to dirt. My bars dropped until I had no signal at all. That's when I saw the lights in the rearview mirror. Twin beams, far back at first, then growing, closer. A vehicle running without sound. No engine, no tires crunching the gravel. Just lights sliding silently across the night, drawing nearer. I pressed the gas, but my car rattled as the road buckled under the tires. The beams behind me grew brighter until they drowned out the interior of my car in white. I turned sharply at the first cut in the fence, tires slipping in the dirt, dust exploding around me. The lights veered after me, keeping perfect pace. My chest clenched with panic. I couldn't breathe right. The fence line opened to another road, paved this time, and I floored it, praying it would take me back to the highway, and then it was gone. The lights, the soundless pursuit. The road itself seemed to straighten, and in another mile I saw the green glow of interstate signs. When I merged back onto the highway, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. The fuel gauge showed a full tank, but the receipt in my pocket told a different story. The paper was blank. No station name, no amount, no numbers at all. Just a slip of thermal paper unmarked. The next morning, when I mentioned it to my buddy in Brownsville, he shook his head. "There's nothing out there," he said. "Hasn't been for years. Closest place you could have stopped would be a Stripes down in Raymondville." I tried pulling the location back up on my phone, but it was gone from the history. No last stop gas and service, no pin, no record of it ever being there. Still, when I close my eyes, I can see that man behind the glass, eyes wide and unblinking, waiting for me to come back. The freight yard sat out on the far eastern lip of El Paso, where the desert sand crept up against chain-link fences and the rusted spines of forgotten rail cars. By day, it was just another carcass of industry, a sprawl of tracks going nowhere, boxcars tagged with sun-peeled graffiti, and steel beams that groaned when the desert wind blew hard enough. But at night, the place had a pulse. That was what the old-timers said, the ones who'd worked the rails back when freight still rattled down through here before the yards were abandoned in the 90s. They swore that if you lingered near the fence around midnight, you'd hear a train before you saw it, long before you should have heard anything given that the nearest active tracks were miles away. The sound would roll in low, a hum of steel on steel that grew into a full-bodied screech, brakes grinding against iron, the thunder of wheels dragging heavy loads. And then, out of the desert dark, a headlight would burn into existence, swinging, across the lines blinding as it drew closer. The phantom train. I never believed it. Not really. I grew up hearing stories like that. Every town has them, and El Paso was no different. My Uncle Pete, who had worked the yards before they shut down, was the one who first told me. He said he'd seen it more than once. A train pulling into the yard, slowing with a metallic shriek that raised goosebumps, only to find there was no crew in the cab, no workers climbing down, no cargo waiting to be unloaded. Just a massive string of rail cars that weren't there a moment before, fading before dawn like smoke. Uncle Pete wasn't the kind of man to chase stories, but I remember the way he looked when he told me. He was dead serious, and that stayed with me. Years later, after I came back from a short-lived job in Dallas and found myself drifting, I started spending time with a group of friends who were drawn to the fringes, the half-dead places most people ignored. We called ourselves explorers, though truthfully we were just thrill-seekers. There was Carlos, who had a thing for climbing rooftops and photographing the city from above, and Marcy, who always carried a handheld recorder like she was auditioning for some paranormal show. Then there was me, restless and unemployed, willing to follow wherever the night led. When Marcy brought up the freight yard, I thought of Uncle Pete instantly, though I didn't admit it. She said she'd heard stories from her cousin, who swore she'd heard the train one night coming home from a late shift. Carlos was immediately in. I tried to laugh it off, but the seed was already planted. Maybe part of me wanted to prove Pete wrong. Maybe part of me wanted to see if he had been telling the truth. We went out there on a Wednesday, the kind of night when the desert air cools quick after sundown but still carries the day's dust in your throat. The yard looked skeletal in the moonlight, steel rails vanishing into nothing, the silhouettes of dead locomotives sitting crooked like old cattle skulls. A barbed wire fence kept most people out, but Carlos found a section where the chain links sagged low and we ducked under. Inside, the place smelled of rust and dry sage. Every sound carried, the crunch of gravel under our boots, the whisper of wind through half-broken boxcars. We wandered first, taking it in, Marcy whispering into her recorder about how many accidents had happened here. Carlos climbed onto the shell of a rusted hopper car and yelled down to us that he could see clear across the lines. I hung back, uneasy. The yard was bigger than I expected, its emptiness stretching wide, and the longer I stood there, the more I felt like we weren't supposed to be. Not because of cops or security, because of something else. The air had a charge to it, like waiting on a storm that hadn't come yet. Midnight crept up fast. We hadn't planned it that way, but when Carlos checked his phone, he said it was 12 on the dot. That was when I noticed the quiet. The cicadas that had buzzed steady since we got there had gone silent. The wind, too. The night held its breath. And then I heard it. At first it was faint, a low hum carried on the still air. Then it grew, unmistakable, the sound of wheels grinding along rails. I froze. Carlos laughed nervously and shouted something about us getting lucky. Marcy held up her recorder like a prayer. The sound swelled, brakes shrieking, metal screaming against metal so loud it hurt my ears. I swore I could feel the vibration under my feet, rattling up through the ties. A light bloomed at the far end of the yard, pale and sickly, not the strong golden beam of a real locomotive. It swept across the rails, cutting through the dark, and for a moment I believed, really believed, that a train was coming in. Boxcars materialized behind the light, black hulks rolling in smooth silence despite the deafening noise. They slid past us one after another, stretching into forever, though the rails they moved on were warped, broken, some even torn up. The impossible sight made my stomach knot. I couldn't look away. Carlos was yelling now, but I barely heard him over the grinding metal. He had his phone out, recording, climbing higher on the car to get a better shot. Marcy was whispering frantically into her recorder, describing every detail, her eyes wide. I just stood there paralyzed as the train shrieked to a halt in front of us. The sound cut off so abruptly that my ears rang in the silence. The engine loomed at the front, dark, its cab windows empty. The cars stretched back farther than the yard itself should have allowed, vanishing into a darkness that wasn't night but something thicker. Carlos whooped and started toward the engine. "Let's go check it out," he shouted. I wanted to grab him, stop him, but my legs wouldn't move. Marcy was trembling beside me, still whispering. Carlos reached the engine ladder, set his foot on the first rung, and that was when the air shifted. A wave of cold rolled off the engine, sharp as ice. The desert didn't get cold like that. Not in September, not all at once. My breath plumed white. Carlos pulled his hand back like he'd touched a hot stove. Though the metal was frostbitten cold, his laugh died in his throat. The cab above him flickered, just for an instant, and I swear I saw movement inside. A shadow, not shaped right. Too tall, too thin. The window glass rippled as if something pressed against it from within. Carlos stumbled back. Marcy finally dropped her recorder, and the sound of it hitting gravel was the only real thing in the world for a moment. Then the doors of the cars began to bang open, one after another, echoing down the line. The sound was hollow, like 100 iron fists slamming at once. The cars yawned wide, but inside there was only blackness, darker than the night. Shapes shifted in that dark, writhing, faceless. The air was full of whispers now, hissing voices overlapping, words in no language I knew. My skin crawled. Carlos shouted, turned, and ran. Marcy clutched my arm so hard her nails dug in. I don't remember deciding to run, but we did. The three of us tearing back across the yard, stumbling over gravel, ducking under the fence like animals chased. Behind us, the sound of the train rose again, the screeching of brakes, the hollow slam of doors, the hiss of whispers. I didn't dare look back. We didn't stop until we were back in Carlos's car, miles away, parked under the yellow glow of a gas station light. None of us spoke. Marcy held her recorder in her lap like it had betrayed her. Carlos deleted the video without a word. I stared out the window, trying to slow my breathing, trying to believe we had imagined it. But the thing is, we didn't imagine the frostbite burn on Carlos's palm where he'd touched the engine. We didn't imagine the way Marcy's recorder, when she finally played it, didn't capture our voices but only the endless grinding sound of a train that wouldn't stop. And I didn't imagine the smell that clung to me for days after, a sharp metallic stench like hot iron and old smoke. My Uncle Pete had been right all along. The yard still lived. The train still came. And I think now, when I close my eyes at night and hear the faint echo of brakes screaming far off in the desert, that one of these nights the train won't stop at the yard. One of these nights, it will come straight through the city, and it won't matter if there's no crew inside, because it isn't hauling cargo, it's hunting. On the wide open flats west of Sweetwater, the land runs on forever, broken only by the gray hush of mesquite and the leaning silhouettes of old barbed wire fences. Out there, with nothing but prairie and sky stretching in every direction, a lone windmill stands by itself. Rust has eaten through most of its frame, the tail bent like a broken wing, its blades warped and jagged from decades of West Texas storms. When the wind catches just right, it doesn't spin the way it should, but jerks in sudden, stuttering turns, groaning like a long scream drawn from metal instead of lungs. Folks around the scattered ranches call it the iron windmill, and if you mention it in the cafe at Roscoe, or to the hands in the stockyards, they'll tell you about the ones who bedded down too close to it and never woke again. I used to think it was only small-town talk, the kind of story that fills silence over coffee in places where nights stretch long and uneventful. But 3 years ago, when the lease on my family's spread was drying up and I was looking for cheap grazing land, I started staying out there myself. The pasture around that windmill hadn't been worked in years, but you could still find good grass in late summer, and I thought a few weeks camping by my herd would save me time and money. First time I drove out, late afternoon heat was pressing, the whole prairie down flat, and the light had that hard copper color you only see out there. From miles away I heard it, the tortured squeal of metal catching wind, and by the time I came up on it, the sound had crawled right into my teeth. Set them on edge like when a fork drags across a plate. That night I rolled out my cot 100 yards downwind. The cattle settled easy enough, bellies full and heads low, but the windmill cried and shuddered until near midnight, like it wasn't powered by air at all, but by something alive and writhing inside. I told myself it was just age and rust, the prairie's version of haunted houseboards creaking. Sometime in the night I woke to silence. The stillness pressed in heavy, not a cow shifting, not a cricket chirping, and then the groaning started again, slower this time, like each turn of the blades dragged up something heavy from deep in the ground. By dawn, one of my calves was missing. No cut fence, no tracks leading off, just gone. I saddled up and rode out, circled for half a day, nothing. I wrote it off as coyotes, but coyotes leave signs, drag marks at least. That evening I bedded closer to the windmill, thinking maybe I'd hear something. The air smelled different around it, sharp like ozone after lightning, but no storm clouds anywhere. I tied my horse to a post and tried to sleep. Around 2 in the morning I heard it clear, the voices. Faint at first, like a hymn carried on the wind from some church far off, only the words didn't fit right. I grew up in pews, I know Amazing Grace and How Great Thou Art backwards and forwards, and this wasn't that. It was the tune all right, but the words ran wrong. Backwards maybe, syllables twisted until they scraped your ear raw. I sat up, heart hammering, and the horse tore loose, bolting into the dark with the whites of its eyes flashing. The hymn rose and fell with each groan of the blades. I told myself it was the prairie playing tricks, sound carrying strange over flat land, but I couldn't shake the way it felt personal, like the voices had waited for me to lay down before they began. At first light, another steer was gone, one of the heaviest in the lot. No prints, no drag, just vanished into air. I should have pulled my herd right then and headed back east, but stubbornness runs in our blood. I stayed one more night. I built a fire high, stacked wood so it would blaze till morning, and I sat there, shotgun across my knees. The windmill screamed off and on, steel grinding against itself in long, desperate cries. Around midnight the fire dimmed low, though I'd just laid on fresh cedar, and shadows stretched farther than they should, reaching out from the base of that windmill. I could see them clear, fingers long and crooked crawling out across the grass. The cattle stirred, bellowed low, and then came a sound that froze me. Boots on dirt, slow steps crunching the way a man walks when he doesn't care who hears him. I raised the shotgun and shouted, but the steps didn't falter. They circled, always just past the edge of firelight, until I thought I'd go mad listening. The hymn swelled again, louder, closer, until it seemed the windmill itself was singing. I don't remember firing, but the gun kicked, and the sound echoed hollow across the prairie. When the echo died, so did the voices. The fire whooshed back, high, like someone had lifted a weight off it. At sunrise, the herd was scattered, every single animal gone. No trail, no prints, nothing but flattened grass where they'd lain. I loaded what gear I could, drove back east, and never once looked in the rearview mirror. Later, when I went to town for supplies, I asked an old man at the feed store about it. He said that windmill wasn't always broken. In the 30s, the rancher who put it up had 7 kids, and one by one they disappeared, each after camping too close on hot nights. The rancher himself went last. Folks found his tent flapped open and empty, bedroll cold. Only the windmill remained, groaning like it was choking on everything it had swallowed. I don't tell this story much. People laugh, say coyotes or rust or that I was half drunk. But sometimes, driving late across the prairie, I hear it again. That drawn-out metal scream drifting through open windows, riding the hot wind. And every time I grip the wheel tighter and keep my eyes dead ahead, because I know if I stop, If I lie down even once more within reach of that thing, the iron windmill won't let me wake again. The old dance hall stood by itself at the end of a cracked county road, a squat wooden building with fading paint that once gleamed white when people dressed in their Sunday best and drove in from small towns all across Fayette County. I first saw it late one evening in September when the heat hadn't yet let go of the land, the air heavy with the smell of grasshoppers and dust. The roof sagged in places, the porch railings were split with age, and the big double doors were chained shut. But something about it pulled at me the way an old song you barely remember tugs at the back of your mind. Folks in LaGrange called it the old Cedar Grove Hall, though nobody had danced inside for 50 years. The stories were the kind you'd hear over a beer in a dark bar, about how music would drift through the fields long after midnight, how lights twinkled behind those broken windows when the moon was high, and how if you stopped your truck on the road, you could sometimes see silhouettes moving in waltz steps across the warped wooden floor. I hadn't planned on stopping, but when I cut the engine, I could hear something faint, almost like wind through, a cracked bottle, then clearer, a slow fiddle, the kind of waltz my grandmother used to hum while she cooked. I sat there with my hand on the wheel, sweat cooling on my neck, listening. The sound carried like it was real, not the kind of ringing you get in your head when you're too tired. I rolled down the window and there was no mistaking it. Someone was playing inside that locked-up ruin. The tune faltered now and then, like old strings stretching under tired fingers, but it was music. My headlights shone across the dry grass, and in that beam I swear I saw the dark shape of a couple gliding together, slow and steady, turning with invisible rhythm before they faded like smoke. Most people would have put the truck in gear and driven, but something about it made me step out. The gravel crunched under my boots and I walked up to the chain-locked doors, heart thudding. The closer I got, the sharper the sound became. It wasn't just a fiddle anymore. I could make out a low thump of bass, the plink of a piano, even laughter carried on the air. But when I pressed my ear to the door, there was nothing but silence, just my own breath and the whine of cicadas in the brush. I pulled back and felt the boards vibrating faintly, like someone on the other side had just stomped a boot heel in time. I stepped back into the moonlight, telling myself I was tired, imagining things. But then I saw shadows through the window glass. Dozens of them, swaying, turning, moving in time to music I couldn't hear anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I asked around at a feed store in town, dropping the name Cedar Grove casual as I could. An old man stocking seed bags looked up at me sharp, like I'd said something I shouldn't. He told me nobody went out there after sundown unless they wanted to invite trouble. He said the place burned once in the late 50s, but the walls never caught, just the inside. They boarded it up after, though no one remembered exactly why. Folks said the last dance held there went on all night, and come morning, not everyone came out. People disappeared, their cars left parked out front with the doors open, purses still on the seats. No bodies were ever found. Some swore they just walked off into the fields and never came back. The sheriff chalked it up to drinking, accidents, people drifting away, but the stories stayed. Every few years some kids would sneak in, and a few of them would come back pale and quiet, not talking about what they'd seen. A couple didn't come back at all. I should have left it alone, but curiosity eats at you. The following weekend, I drove back with a flashlight, telling myself I wanted to prove it was just wind and echoes. The doors were chained, but one of the back windows had its glass missing. I climbed in, scraping my jeans on the jagged wood. Inside it smelled of charred beams and dust, the air stale like a long sealed attic. My light cut across the hall and I saw rows of old folding chairs stacked against the wall, half-collapsed tables and a warped dance floor darkened from fire years ago. My boots scuffed and echoed as I moved. I stood there breathing in the silence, waiting to feel foolish, but the air pressed close around me like the place was holding its breath. Then the fiddle started again, soft, coming from no direction and every direction at once. I swung my light around, but there was nobody. Still, the sound grew richer, layered with piano chords and the faint murmur of voices. I could see the dust shifting on the floor, stirred by feet that weren't there. My chest tightened as the room grew warmer, though no fire burned. The music swelled until it was all around me, drowning out my thoughts. My light flickered and dimmed, and in that darkness figures slid out of the corners. Men in dark suits, women in long skirts, hair pinned back, their faces pale and blurry like photographs left out in the sun. They turned in smooth waltz steps, their shadows stretching long across the boards. One of them passed close enough that I smelled perfume, powdery and sweet, and I felt a brush of cold air against my arm. I backed toward the window, trying to climb out, but the opening seemed farther than before. The music shifted tempo, faster now, a wild reel, and the shadows turned frantic, jerking in time like puppets on strings. Their faces twisted into empty grins, mouths opening and closing without sound. My flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered across the floor, rolling into the dark. I stumbled, catching myself against a table, and when I looked up, they had all stopped. Every shadow had turned toward me, heads cocked, their blurred faces staring. For a heartbeat, the hall was silent again. Then the voices rose, laughter sharp and layered, echoing off the walls, not joyous but mocking, hungry. I bolted, scrambling for the window, and hands cold as stone brushed my back as I pulled myself through. I landed hard outside, gasping, and when I looked back, the windows were black and empty. No music, no laughter, just the dark skeleton of the old hall standing against the stars. I didn't wait around to see if it would start again. I drove straight to town, headlights cutting the night, every mile stretching long. Even now, weeks later, when the wind picks up in the fields near my house, I hear faint strains of fiddle drifting through the night. Sometimes I catch movement in the corner of my eye, shapes turning slow in a dance I can't join. I don't drive that road anymore, but I know the hall waits there, empty, but never truly still. Its floor alive with footsteps that never stopped. People say old music fades, but in Fayette County it never does. It plays on long after the band is gone, waiting for someone foolish enough to open the door and take a partner's hand. On the edge of Dallas, past the last sprawl of strip malls and subdivisions, there's a stretch of forgotten land where old utility structures rot in the weeds. That's where the black water tank stands, a rusted monolith rising out of the mesquite and briars streaked dark from decades of rain and neglect. It isn't really black, not in paint, but the iron has corroded into that deep brown red, and the damp streaks that run down its sides give it the look of something that's been bleeding for years. Local kids had been skating the cracked slabs of old asphalt that ringed it for as long as I can remember, a kind of makeshift park hidden where no one cared to chase them away. The tank had been fenced once, back when it was still in use, but the chain link is bent and collapsed now, tangled, with vines. Inside, the air smells of iron and stagnant water, though no one's sure if any remains inside the tower's belly. I first heard the story from my nephew, who was 16 and lived with his board under his arm. He and a few others went out there one hot summer afternoon, the kind of day where the Texas sky is pale white with heat, and the cicadas shriek until your ears ring. They brought a boombox, some tall boys swiped from someone's uncle, and they skated the cracked pad until the sun started to slide down. That's when one of them looked up and saw the face. It wasn't graffiti. That was their first thought, but the kids around here know every tag in a 20-mile radius. And this wasn't spray paint. It was a shape in the rust, dark streaks that seemed to have settled just so, forming the outline of a man's face. Long, gaunt, with deep sockets where eyes might be, a narrow nose, and a mouth that seemed stretched too wide. My nephew swore it hadn't been there before. He'd been skating at that place for years and never once seen anything but rust streaks. But now, as the light bled out of the sky, the shape was clear, and the longer they looked, the more it seemed to look back. One of the kids, a boy named Marcos, tossed his board and shouted at it, laughing to keep the others calm. But the sound of his voice hit the curved tank and came back wrong, like it was being whispered by someone inside the steel belly. Another kid climbed the ladder a few rungs, meaning to prove it was nothing but rust, but he came down quick, saying the metal was hot. Too hot, like the sun was still beating on it even though dusk had settled. They left in a hurry, all pretending they weren't rattled, but my nephew told me he couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face again, except it wasn't streaked rust. It was pale flesh pressed against a window that shouldn't exist, watching. 2 weeks later, Marcos went missing. His mother said he hadn't come home after school. They found his board propped against the fence at the tank, but no sign of him. The sheriff's office treated it like another runaway, but the kids whispered about the face in the rust. They said it wasn't just a stain. It moved. Some swore that if you stared at it long enough, the lips parted like it was trying to speak. My nephew stopped skating there, but others didn't. Teenagers are drawn to places like that. Danger, wrapped in the thrill of a dare. More boards turned up leaning against the fence, no kids to claim them. The city eventually posted a notice planning to cut the tank down, but nothing ever came of it. I went out myself once, years after Marcos vanished, because I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't just kid talk. I parked off the service road, walked through the grass grown waist-high, and found the tower looming over me like a shadow that had weight. The rust pattern was still there, darker now, more defined. You could see the hollows of the cheeks, the curve of the lips. I felt the urge to climb, to put my hand against it. But when I got close, the smell of wet iron was overwhelming, like a slaughterhouse drain. I heard the faint scrape of metal from inside, though no wind touched it, and I backed away. That night I dreamed of the tank. I saw its black shape against the stars, heard dripping echo from its empty gut. A man's voice whispered my name, drawn out slow, and I woke sweating with the sound of water still dripping in my ears. I thought it was nothing but suggestion until I saw the news the next morning. Another boy had gone missing. His truck was found idling not far from the tank. No sign of him. People in Dallas barely talk about it now. Growth swallowed most of that land, but the water tower still stands, hidden behind new construction and silent fields. The kids don't skate there anymore. Parents warn them off, but sometimes at night you can see movement around the fence line. Shadows climbing, boards clattering on old concrete, though no one's there when you get close. Some say it's the ones who went missing, still trying to land tricks in the dark, their faces melted into the tank's skin. I don't know if I believe all of that. I just know that if you go out there at dusk when the heat starts to bleed and the sky bruises purple, you can see a face in the rust. And if you stare too long, you might see it shift, might catch it opening its mouth, the lips parting in a soundless word you don't want to hear. I tell you now, if you ever find yourself on the outskirts of Dallas and stumble across a rusted black tower rising out of the weeds, don't look too close. Don't listen to the drip inside, because once it knows your face, it doesn't forget. Hollow Creek was the kind of place you could drive past 100 times and never notice. A narrow 2-lane road cut through thick East Texas woods, a wall of pines and oaks so dense they seemed to huddle close to the asphalt, leaning over like they wanted to swallow the whole strip of pavement. Out there near Nacogdoches, where the humidity never seemed to lift and the air always smelled faintly of sap and wet earth, the nights were darker than most. No streetlights, no houses with porch bulbs burning, just the woods, the road, and the bridge over Hollow Creek. That bridge was only a few car lengths wide, a humped patch of concrete poured decades ago, its metal guardrails dull with rust and streaked with the white residue of rain that had run over them countless times. Folks who lived nearby claimed you could still see the names of kids scratched into the cement from back in the 50s, when teenagers would park their trucks and drink beer on the edge of the woods. And like most places tucked far from town, the bridge came with its own story. They called it Hollow Creek Crossing, but everyone who'd lived in the area longer than a decade knew to drive fast across it, never stopping, never rolling down the window when you hit that stretch. Because if you did, you'd hear it, the crying. I didn't believe it the first time I heard. A girl I'd been dating told me the legend in that half-serious way people talk when they want you to be scared but don't quite believe it themselves. She said the crying came from underneath the bridge, soft at first like a child whimpering, then louder, building until it felt like it was right under your tires. And if you had the courage, or the stupidity, to slow down, you might see the wet handprints that appeared on your windows, pressed into the glass like someone was begging to be let in. I laughed it off back then. Texas backroads are full of those stories. Every little town has its haunted church, its headless hitchhiker, its Bloody Mary bathroom mirror. But years later, I drove out there myself. Not because I wanted to see something. I was on my way back from Lufkin, heading home through the backroads, my GPS stubbornly routing me down unfamiliar stretches, shaving 15 minutes off the drive at the cost of putting me somewhere I didn't belong. And the road dipped, the woods closed in tighter, and I found myself slowing, headlights catching the curve ahead where the bridge waited. It was close to midnight, and the air outside was heavy, the kind of sticky warmth that clings to your clothes even with the AC on full blast. I rolled down the window just a crack, hoping for the faintest breeze. That's when I thought I heard it, just for a second. A sound that could have been the creek gurgling under the bridge, could have been cicadas buzzing low. But no. There was a rhythm to it, a softness that didn't belong to insects or water. It sounded like a child, the kind of quiet, breathless crying that shakes between words. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, leaned forward, telling myself I was imagining it, that I'd primed my mind with old stories and now the night was playing along. But the sound grew louder as my tires hit the bridge. Not from the woods, not from behind me, from directly below. It was as if something was pacing the beams, keeping perfect speed with my car. I pressed harder on the gas, telling myself I wasn't going to look, I wasn't going to check my mirrors. But a glance slipped anyway and my breath stopped. The rear passenger window had a handprint, clear as day in the faint glow of the dash lights. 5 splayed fingers, streaked and wet, pressed from the outside. I know what condensation looks like, and I know the patterns you get when your own sweaty skin brushes glass. This was neither. The handprint was too perfect, too sharp, each finger distinct, each curve and ridge visible like someone had leaned in close and pressed hard, leaving a cold, damp outline that hadn't been there a moment before. I gritted my teeth and floored the accelerator. The bridge behind me, shrinking fast, the sound of the crying fading as the woods swallowed it whole. When I finally pulled into the lit stretch of a gas station miles down the road, the handprint was gone. The glass was clean, dry, like nothing had touched it at all. That should have been the end of it. One strange night, one story to tell and laugh about later. But Hollow Creek Crossing didn't let go of me. It came back in dreams, in the edges of half-remembered nightmares where I'd be driving that road again, the trees leaning in closer and closer, the crying louder until it was inside the car with me. I'd wake up sweating, the sound of it still in my ears. And then there were the people. Once you notice something, it starts popping up everywhere. I overheard it at a diner near town. 2 old men talking about a cousin who'd wrecked his truck right past Hollow Creek, swearing before he died that he'd seen a girl in the road, crying and reaching for him. Another time, a coworker mentioned it in passing, saying her grandmother used to tell her never to go there after dark, that the crying belonged to a mother who'd thrown herself off the bridge with her baby back in the Depression. Depending on who you asked, it was a car accident or a flood or something darker. The details changed, but the core never did. Someone had died there, and they weren't done crying. Months later, against better judgment, I went back. Not alone this time. A friend of mine, Sean, had a taste for this sort of thing. He liked ghost hunts, the rush of adrenaline, the idea that he could stare something terrifying in the face and come back bragging. We loaded into his truck one humid Friday night, a cooler of beer rattling between us, both of us trying too hard to sound casual as the miles ticked down toward the crossing. When the trees closed in, we killed the music, rolled the windows all the way down, and coasted toward the bridge. The night air pressed in, hot and buzzing with cicadas, and for a moment I thought maybe it wouldn't happen, maybe it had all been in my head. But then the crying started. Soft, pitiful, rising like breath held too long and released at last. Sean laughed nervously, whispered, "Hear that?" And I nodded. We slowed almost to a crawl. The sound grew sharper, desperate. And then came the first handprint. It bloomed across the windshield in front of Sean, small and pale, as if a child had leaned forward, pressing its palm against the glass. Sean cursed, jerked the wheel, but the hand didn't fade. Another appeared near mine, a longer one this time, fingers spread wide. Then another on the back window. They came in quick succession, dozens of them, pressing against the glass from every side. My throat closed, my skin prickling with cold though the air was still heavy and hot. Sean slammed his foot down and the truck roared. But even at 60, 70, the prints stayed pressed harder as though whatever they belonged to was clinging tight, trying to claw its way inside. And the crying wasn't outside anymore. It was in the cab, between us, behind us, echoing in every inch of the truck. I could feel the breath of it on the back of my neck. When the bridge was gone, when the road leveled and the trees thinned, it all stopped. The crying cut off mid-breath. The handprints vanished. The cab was silent except for our ragged breathing and the rumble of the engine. We didn't say a word until we hit the bright wash of a convenience store lot, both of us sitting there in the harsh fluorescent light like we'd just crawled out of something rotten. Sean swore he'd never go back. I didn't argue, but the sound stayed with me. It still does. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night certain I've heard it again. Faint at first, like it's starting over, building louder. A cry that isn't human, not anymore. A sound that doesn't stop once you've really heard it. And sometimes when I walk past my car on humid mornings, I swear the windows are streaked with small, damp handprints. Fem 402 runs quiet through the flat miles of Garza County, the pavement rolling over dust and cattle guard after cattle guard, with only windmills, mesquite, and the occasional ranch gate breaking the view. Out there on the shoulder, set back, a little from the road, sits what's left of Prairie Dog Schoolhouse. The paint is long gone, eaten away by West Texas sun and sand, the boards warped and split like tired teeth. The bell tower caved in years ago. The windows are busted out, jagged glass hanging like old gums, and the front door hangs by a single hinge, slapping when the wind comes hard from the south. Most folks speed past it without looking, but when you grow up nearby, you learn its shape against the sky the way you know a scar on your own hand. My grandmother used to say it was cursed. She wasn't one for stories, but when she drove me, to spur to buy feed, she would nod toward it and mutter, "Voices don't leave a place that easy." She never pulled over, and I never asked her to. I came to know more about it years later when I was 22 and stuck in that strange limbo after dropping out of South Plains College. My buddy Leon worked nights running cattle for his uncle, and I worked at the feed store in Post. We had nothing but time and boredom, and it wasn't long before we dared each other to check out the old schoolhouse. A couple beers helped. One Friday night, just before summer burned into full heat, we loaded a cooler in the back of his Chevy and headed down FM 402. It was one of those nights when the wind carried dust like smoke, the kind that makes headlights, into weak yellow tunnels. We parked in the ditch across from the schoolhouse. Even sitting in the truck, I felt it pressing at me, that hollow shell looming against the dark sky, its empty windows staring down the road like dead eyes. We didn't bring flashlights, just our lighters and the glow of Leon's flip phone. The moment we stepped inside, the air felt cooler, like stepping into a cellar, though the night outside was still holding steady at 90 degrees. The floorboards groaned under our boots. The place smelled of dry rot and dust with an edge of something sour that made me think of damp cloth. The classroom stretched out in front of us, rows of desks still standing though most were broken or tilted, their iron legs rusted through the wood. A blackboard clung stubbornly to the far wall, cracked down the center, with faint chalk scratches you could still make out if you squinted. Numbers, spelling lists, as though a teacher had walked away mid-lesson and never came back. On the teacher's desk sat a stack of books swollen with mildew, covers warped into unrecognizable shapes. It would have been creepy enough like that, but what froze us both was the whisper of sound. Faint, like air moving through a hollow pipe, but patterned. Not wind. It came from the far end of the room, lifting and falling in a rhythm too steady to ignore. Leon swore under his breath and lit his lighter. The flame shook in his hand, showing more dust than detail. I told myself it was the wind, but I knew wind doesn't break into syllables. The sound was voices thin and far away, like children repeating after someone. The hair on my arms stood stiff. Leon killed his lighter with a snap and whispered that we should leave. I wanted to, but my feet carried me closer to the blackboard. The whisper grew clearer, high-pitched tones overlapping, a sing-song of vowels, a dozen voices, maybe more, repeating a teacher's cadence. I swear I could pick out words half-formed and shivering. A is for apple, B is for ball. My knees went soft. Leon grabbed my arm and tugged hard, pulling me back toward the door. We didn't make it far. As we crossed the middle of the room, one of the desks scraped across the floor all on its own. It shifted just a foot, but the sound of it shrieked like metal. Leon dropped his lighter, and in the dark we both froze. The voices cut off. Dead silence filled the room, thick enough to choke. That's when we heard the slam. The door we'd come through snapped shut, and with it, the room seemed to tighten around us. I couldn't breathe right. I could feel sweat rolling down my spine, but the air stayed cold enough to make my teeth chatter. Leon cursed and started pushing at desks, trying to find a path. We stumbled together until we hit the wall. My hands brushed the cracked chalkboard, and I felt grooves, fresh ones, long scratches that hadn't been there a second ago. My fingernails fit inside them like the marks had been carved by hands as desperate as mine. Then came the footsteps, light ones, quick, like children darting across wooden floors in bare feet. They circled us close enough that I could hear breath. I wanted to shout, but my throat locked. Leon grabbed me again and shoved me forward, and by some grace the front door gave way. We tumbled out into the dust and heat, the sound of the wind swallowing everything else. Neither of us looked back as we bolted for the truck. We peeled off the shoulder so fast the cooler toppled in the bed, cans scattering down the road like silver sparks. We never told anyone exactly what happened. We let it pass as just another dumb night, too much beer, nerves getting the best of us. But I couldn't forget the voices, the way they rose and fell like the breath of something still living inside that ruin. A few weeks later, Leon wouldn't drive past the schoolhouse anymore. He'd take the long way, adding 20 minutes to his route just to avoid FM 402. He said he kept hearing the sound of desks scraping in his dreams. I didn't argue because I'd started hearing the same thing. Only mine wasn't in dreams. Mine came in the quiet moments before sleep in my own bedroom back in Post. A faint dragging, wood against wood, and underneath it, the rise of children's voices, reciting lessons they never finished. One night near the end of July, I woke up to find my window open, though I knew I'd latched it. The curtain shifted in a wind that wasn't there. On the desk by the wall, my college textbooks sat open. Words had been underlined in chalk, pale, streaks across the pages. I don't own chalk. My hands shook so bad I couldn't shut the book. I left it that way until morning, when the marks were gone, but the desk itself carried fresh scratches, faint lines the length of fingers. I moved out of my mother's place by September, claiming I needed work in Lubbock. The truth was, I couldn't stand the thought of that sound following me any longer. Leon didn't come with me. His uncle found him one morning in the barn, sitting on a hay bale, eyes glassy and unfocused. He wouldn't answer questions, just rocked back and forth and whispered the alphabet over and over. They put him in a facility in Abilene. Last I heard, he still won't speak except to mutter those same lessons. Folks say his mind snapped from drugs, but I know better. He carried something out of that place with him, something that won't let go. I don't drive FM 402 anymore either, though part of me still wants to. Part of me wants to stop the truck, walk through that broken door again, and ask those voices what they want, but I know better than to listen too long. Out there on the prairie, under the weight of sun and wind, voices don't leave easy. They stay in the boards, in the glass, in the air itself. And if you give them even a moment, they'll follow you, home, whispering your lessons until you can't remember which words were ever your own. The shack sat low and ugly against the dust-swept plain, just a corrugated steel box squatting at the edge of the lease road. Men who worked the rigs in the Midland Basin said it had been there longer than most of the wells, maybe since the 50s, thrown up as a break room or a pump house, though nobody kept equipment in it now. The door hung crooked on its hinges. The floor was pocked with oil stains that never dried, and the windows were so clouded with dust they barely let the daylight through. When the crews stopped by, usually on shifts that stretched too long into the night, they swore the shack breathed, Not like a house creaking with the wind, but like a lung, pulling something foul up from the earth and letting it roll out in waves of crude oil stink and sulfur sharp enough to sting the back of your throat. Most men laughed it off, roughnecks, always do, but even the hardest hands didn't linger inside long. The ones who did came out shaking their heads, mumbling about the way their radios went wild, screaming static that sounded like voices tangled in it. I was one of them. Not the laughing kind. I'd worked oil fields across the Permian for 20 years, driving pipes and turning wrenches, and I knew when a place didn't sit right. That shack had weight to it, like the air around it pressed, harder on your shoulders. The first time I went in, it was just me and a new hire, a kid named Rudy who still had soft hands and a city boy watch on his wrist. We'd been running casing all night, covered in mud and drilling fluid, and we stopped by the shack to eat our lunches. The sun was barely coming up, turning the horizon a dusty orange, and the shack looked like a black tooth against it. Rudy opened the door first and gagged, said it smelled like a busted septic tank mixed with tar. I told him that was just sour gas, nothing to worry about, but I knew better. Sour gas has a sharp bite, sure, but this was thicker, heavier, like it clung to your lungs. Inside it was dim and close, the heat trapped even before the day had burned hot. We sat on an overturned spool of wire, eating sandwiches out of wax, paper. Rudy had his portable radio clipped to his belt, one of those cheap ones the kids used to play music. Halfway through the sandwich, it started buzzing, loud and angry. Not just static, but something under it, a rhythm like a voice trying to push through. He tapped it, shook it, but the noise only grew. I'll never forget the look on his face when the sound shifted, just for a second, into something that was almost words. A whisper, low and drawn out, like it came from the bottom of a well. He swore it said his name. He dropped the radio onto the floor and it clattered against the steel, still hissing and spitting. We left our food half-eaten and walked out fast. Him pale as chalk, me not far behind. The radio stopped the moment we stepped outside. Word travels quick among hands, and soon enough everyone had their own shack story. A driller said he heard a woman crying inside, even though he'd been alone. Another swore he saw boot prints in the oil stains, fresh and wet, though no one else had come in. More than once, men said the door slammed shut behind them and wouldn't open until they shoved it with both shoulders. Still, it was just stories, and stories fade when paychecks come steady. I might have left it alone myself if not for the night Danny Ruiz disappeared. Danny was a night pusher, tough as nails, the kind of man who'd worked rigs since he was 16 and didn't scare easy. One evening he told the crew he was going to the shack to take a leak out of the wind. He never came back. At first nobody thought much of it. Sometimes men walked off, drove into town, found a bar or a motel to chase off the loneliness. But his truck was still at the site, keys on the dash, and his lunchbox sat unopened in the doghouse. They searched the leases, the mesquite scrub, even the dry draws, but nothing turned up. The sheriff's deputies brought dogs that sniffed, all around, and one of them went wild near the shack, whining and scratching at the door until its handler dragged it off. They found no sign of Danny inside, just the stink of sulfur and oil that clung to their clothes for days. After that, the shack sat alone. Most of the boys refused to even look at it when they drove past, but I couldn't leave it alone. Something about Danny's face stuck in my mind. The way he'd laughed just hours before, dust on his boots, grease on his hands. I'd known him too long not to wonder. So one night, after a long shift, I parked my truck by the access road and went in. The wind was kicking up dust, the rigs throwing their red flares into the sky like hell's own torches. I carried my flashlight and a little handheld radio, thinking maybe I'd catch what others had heard. The door screeched when I pulled it open, and the smell hit me like a wall, stronger than before. It coated my tongue, made my eyes water. I forced myself inside and shut the door. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of heat that felt alive. My light swept across rusted tools, broken chairs, empty barrels. Nothing moved, but I felt like something was watching from the corners where the light didn't reach. I clicked on the radio, and instantly the static roared to life, louder than it should have been for such a small speaker. I held it close and listened. Under the hiss was a sound like breathing, slow and steady, not mine. I spoke Danny's name out loud, my voice sounding too small in that steel box. The static flared, a shriek so sharp I dropped the radio. It bounced, once, and then from the floor came a whisper, faint but clear. "Get out." I froze, the words cutting through me like ice. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the signal, but the voice wasn't just sound. It was in my bones, vibrating through me. I swung the flashlight across the floor, and that's when I saw them. Fresh footprints, dark with oil, leading from the corner straight to where I stood. They weren't mine, and they were too big for Rudy, too wide for any boot I knew. The air turned hotter, choking, and the sulfur smell sharpened until I thought I'd pass out. Then, behind me, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. I lunged at it shoulder first, shoving until it gave way, and I stumbled out into the night air, coughing and shaking. When I looked back, the shack sat quiet, still as it had always been. My radio lay just outside, dead and silent. I didn't tell anyone what I'd heard, not in detail. Men don't like stories that close to the truth, not when they've got another 12-hour shift to face. But I never went back inside, and when the crews ask why, I just say some places don't want company. They nod, and none of them argue. Every once in a while, driving the lease roads late at night, I catch a whiff through the truck's vents. That same mix of crude and sulfur, thick and sour. It never lasts long, but when it does, I shut off the radio and keep my eyes on the horizon. Because if you listen too close, you'll hear more than static. You'll hear the ones that never made it out. The Brazos bottomland doesn't drain the way folks expect it to. When the rains come hard enough to drown out the gravel roads and make the pecan orchards stand like islands, the water settles into the low places like it has every intention of staying. The old barn on the Keller property had been one of those low places for near 70 years, built on a strip of floodplain where the Brazos liked to flex its weight. Nobody had used the barn since the 60s, when the last of the Keller boys died in a tractor accident, and over the decades it sagged into the mud like a bloated carcass. The tin roof rusted to a dull brown, one wall bowed out, and the doors hung by a single iron hinge that creaked when the wind cut across the fields. But what drew people back to it wasn't nostalgia, or curiosity, or even the daredevil streak that ran through country teenagers like rabies. It was the lights. After the spring floods of 1997, when the Brazos swelled over its banks for 2 weeks straight, folks down near East Columbia started reporting lantern glow inside the Keller barn. Not a pale trick of lightning or the reflection of headlights from FM 521, but a steady yellow burn like somebody had trimmed a wick and set it just inside. The barn was half drowned at the time, water lapping at its window slats, but the glow never wavered. Sheriff McGraw said it was swamp gas, though everyone knew swamp gas didn't arrange itself into lantern-shaped halos that swung gently back and forth. Word spread fast, and the barn picked up the kind of reputation that makes grown men avoid a stretch of land like it's cursed, and teenagers dare each other to wade through waist-high water just to peek inside. I wasn't a kid anymore when I decided to go. I was 36, divorced, trying to scrape together roofing work after a bad fall had ruined my back, and mostly just bitter enough at the world that I thought daring the flooded barn might put a dent in the numbness. My Uncle Roy had been the one who told me the real stories. He said the lantern light didn't just glow, it moved. Sometimes it circled the inside of the barn, bobbing like someone carried it along the rafters. Sometimes two lights appeared, swinging opposite one another, as though men worked through the night to load phantom hay bales. And every so often, when the rains had been heavy enough to cover the old stalls, you could hear the braying of mules that had drowned long ago, echoing out into the pecan groves. That April, the bottomland had gone under again, rain hammering for 6 days straight until the river ate up the edges of the county roads. The barn sat in a mirror of brown floodwater, its reflection rippling under the low clouds. I parked Roy's old Chevy on the shoulder where the dirt turned to soup and pulled on my boots, though the mud took them quick and I ended up sloshing barefoot the last 100 yards. The air smelled of rotted wood and sweet pecan husks, with that undertone of stagnant swamp that makes your stomach tighten. The barn leaned like it wanted to sleep, but from inside glowed a soft amber light, steady and patient as a heart. The water hit mid-thigh when I reached the wall. It was colder than I expected, like it had seeped straight from the bones of the river. I circled to the double doors, one of which sagged inward just enough to let me slip through. The light flickered against the boards, casting long shadows across the water. I hesitated there, my hand braced on the swollen wood, and in that moment, I swear I heard breathing. Not mine, not the shallow pant of a man fighting through muddy current, but something deeper, slower, with a faint whistle at the end like water pulling through broken teeth. I pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The lantern hung from a nail just above the crossbeam. Flame steady, glass globe dry despite the water that lapped 3 feet up the barn wall. That detail twisted my gut more than anything else. The wick burned clean. No smoke, no heat haze. Just a neat flame suspended as if the world outside hadn't been drowning for days. The water inside carried floating debris, half a fence post, a child's shoe swollen with mud, a pale knot of something. That might have been animal hide, but none of it touched the lantern's glow. I waded closer, the boards groaning under invisible weight, and realized the light didn't warm the air. My skin prickled with goose flesh. I held out my hand and felt nothing but the damp chill. That was when I noticed the eyes. Reflections at, first I thought off the water's surface. 2 pale ovals low to the ground, catching the lantern like cat eyes in a thicket. Then they blinked, and I heard a shuffle beneath the water, a sound of hooves dragging through mud. The smell of sulfur hit me so hard I gagged, sharp and rotten, carried on a gust that shouldn't have existed in that sealed space. The lantern swung, slow and deliberate, casting the beams across the rafters, and for a split second I saw shapes. Men bent at the shoulders, hats pulled low, leading mule teams that vanished the moment the light shifted. Their outlines clung to my eyes like after images burned onto film. I told myself to turn, to wade back out, but something tugged at me deeper than fear. A sound began, faint and tuneless, rising from the far stall where the shadows pooled thick. It was humming, low and ragged, the kind a man might use to keep rhythm while working alone. The water rippled with each note, circles widening until they brushed my knees. I found myself stepping forward, hypnotized, though every nerve screamed to leave. The humming grew sharper, splitting into voices layered and discordant like a choir drowning in their own hymn. I reached the stall and saw the shape of a ladder rising from the flood, its rungs slick with algae, leading up into the loft that sagged half-collapsed. The lantern's glow shifted higher, swinging now as if carried up the ladder by unseen hands. I should have turned then, but I grabbed the rungs and pulled myself up, water sheeting off my clothes. The loft groaned under me, dust puffing despite the damp. Hay remnants clung to the corners, matted dark, and the smell of decay thickened, until I could taste it. The lantern rested 10 feet away on the beam, though I hadn't seen anyone set it there. I reached for it and the loft shifted, pitching under my weight. My palm brushed glass that wasn't hot but icy, like clutching a block pulled from a freezer. The flame guttered, then surged, and in that flare I saw their faces. They hung from the rafters, a row of them, ropes sunk deep into necks swollen and black. Men in work shirts, suspenders, eyes bulging white. Mules floated in the air beside them, hooves thrashing slow, mouths bubbling froth. The humming turned to gurgling, water rushing from slack throats, and the entire loft tilted as though dragged beneath a tide. I stumbled, lantern slipping from my grasp, and it fell without, splash into the flood below. The flame stayed bright, burning under the water, and the barn filled with the sound of hooves hammering against boards, echoing like 100 horses penned in panic. The ropes creaked, beams bowed, and I knew if I didn't run, I'd never leave. Dropped into the water, choking on the stench, and shoved through the doorway as the barn shuddered. Behind me, lanterns flared one by one along the rafters, a dozen, 2 dozen glowing like fireflies trapped in glass. The humming swelled into a hymn I recognized from childhood Sundays, warped and backward, each word dragged through molasses. The water slapped against my chest, dragging me down, and for one terrible moment I felt hands clutching my ankles, fingers slick and strong. I kicked free, skin tearing where nails bit, and lunged toward the pecan grove. When I looked back, the barn leaned heavier, its doors yawning open, the lantern's glow spilling onto the flood like veins of gold. I made it to the truck, soaked and stinking, and drove blind until the bottomland lay miles behind. I never went back, though some nights when the rains come hard and the Brazos rises, I see a faint glow through the tree line. Folks still whisper about the Keller barn, though most steer wide of that stretch of river road. But when the air's thick with rot and the water's high, you can hear the hymn if you roll your window down, drifting on the wind in a voice that doesn't belong to the living. And I know, without ever stepping foot there again, that the lanterns still burn underwater, waiting for the next fool to wade inside. The Greyhound station on South 8th Street in Waco had always been there in the background of the city, a brick husk with faded signage, its neon bus logo long gone, just a rusted outline still bolted to the wall above the locked front doors. I remember first seeing it as a kid when my uncle used to drive us down that way toward the Brazos. He'd point and say that once upon a time every soul from here to Dallas passed through that depot. Soldiers, runaways, preachers, and drunks, all waiting under the fluorescent hum for a ticket east or west. By the time I was old enough to drive, it had been closed for years. Windows boarded, paint peeling, and most folks just said to steer clear of it. Even the homeless didn't linger long under its awning, but there were always stories. My grandmother swore her cousin had gone into the men's room during a layover in the 50s and never came back. Nobody saw him leave. No one claimed to have, called him away, and the bus rolled on without him. There were others too, whispered tales that now and then, if you peered through the cracks, you'd see clerks in pressed uniforms behind the ticket counter, caps tilted, eyes pale as wax, their mouths moving silently as if they were selling tickets that no longer existed. I hadn't thought about that place in years until I came back through Waco on a business trip in the fall. I'd booked a cheap motel on Franklin Avenue, the kind of place with cigarette burns in the blankets, and around midnight, restless, I went out walking. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of the river, and I found myself drifting block by block until the outline of the depot rose up in front of me. The old marquee still hung crooked, the glass doors chained, weeds poking through the sidewalk. For a minute I stood there staring, wondering why it unsettled me so much. Then I noticed the faintest glow leaking from the side windows, the ones that should have been dark. A soft yellow light, not like a street lamp, but warmer, like bulbs, from another era. Against my better judgment, I walked around the building, and that's when I found a service door at the back, cracked just enough to suggest someone had been inside. I told myself it was probably squatters, or maybe the city left it open by mistake. But when I slipped through, the smell hit me first. Not the mold and rot you'd expect, but old perfume and smoke, like an ashtray left in a hotel lobby from 70 years ago. The corridor was dim, and yet the wall fixtures still glowed faintly, as if powered by some phantom grid. I followed the tiled hall past a row of shuttered vending machines, their glass smeared, candy bars turned to fossilized blocks. The lobby spread out ahead, and that's where I froze. There were people, not many, just a handful scattered in the wooden seats, hats pulled low, coats buttoned to the throat. They didn't move like normal people. They sat too still, heads tilted slightly down, and yet when I shifted my weight on the tiles, every head turned in unison. Faces pale, eyes dark hollows, mouths tight. At the ticket counter stood a clerk in a starched shirt and tie, cap perched above a waxy forehead. He looked right at me, though I swear his pupils were cloudy like old glass. I should have left. Every part of me screamed to leave, but I didn't. Something about the way the clerk lifted his hand, pointing toward the restrooms, pulled me forward like a tether. I walked across that floor, hearing only the faint squeak of my shoes and a distant hum, like a diesel engine idling somewhere far below. The restroom door stood half open, its metal sign dulled with age. I pushed inside. At first it looked ordinary, rows of chipped sinks, cracked mirrors, urinals yellowed with time. But there was water pooled across the floor, shallow but spreading, as though from a pipe-long burst. My reflection wavered in the glass, and for one brief second I swore it wasn't me staring back. The face looking out was younger, thinner, wearing a fedora. And behind that reflection in the stalls I saw feet. Rows of shoes pointed toward the floor, unmoving. Too many of them for the number of stalls there. I stepped back, heart pounding, and the lights above flickered. That hum deepened into something like a growl, vibrating the tiles beneath my feet. The door slammed behind me. I spun, but there was no handle on the inside, only bare metal. My breath came shallow as I pounded, calling out, but no one answered. Then came the footsteps. Slow, dragging, from the stalls. One by one. The shoes scraped forward and the stall doors began to creak open. Not from the hinges, but as if the wood itself was groaning awake. I caught a glimpse of something stepping out. Figures in dated suits, eyes dark as holes, skin slack like damp cloth. I backed toward the sinks, and every mirror above them filled not with my reflection, but with a line of ticket clerks, all identical, all staring, their mouths opening in silent screams. I grabbed at the nearest faucet, desperate for anything, real, but when I twisted it, black water spewed out, reeking of iron and rot. It splashed across my hands and spread across the counter, dripping onto the floor with a hiss. The figures drew closer. Their movements weren't jerky or monstrous, but steady, patient, as if they had done this countless times before. I closed my eyes and shouted that I didn't belong here, that I wasn't on any list, that I just came in by mistake. When I opened them again, the restroom was empty. No water, no footsteps, just the cracked tile and silence. The door behind me swung open as though it had never been stuck. I staggered out into the lobby, expecting the clerks and passengers, but the seats were bare. Dust coated everything, thick enough to choke on. The ticket counter was empty, the glass cracked, the uniform gone. The only sound was my heartbeat and the faint scuttle of rats in the rafters. The lights were dead. I stumbled through the hall, burst out the service door, and stood in the night air gasping. The building loomed dark behind me, lifeless, its windows broken, no trace of the glow I had seen. I walked fast, then ran, not stopping until I reached the motel. That night I sat on the bed shaking, staring at my shoes, still wet though the restroom floor had been dry when I fled. I never went back. I told myself I must have dreamed it, must have let the stories creep too far into me. But a week later back home, I opened my suitcase and found something that wasn't mine. A folded bus ticket, stamped Waco to Dallas, dated July 17, 1948. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but my name was typed neatly across the top as if I had purchased it. I keep it locked away now, hidden where no one will stumble on it. Some nights, when the house is quiet, I swear I can't hear that low diesel hum under the floorboards, steady and waiting, like a bus idling in the dark, ready to depart. The drowned road under Toledo Bend is something folks around that reservoir don't talk about much, but everybody knows it's there. The old highway used to run through before they dammed up the Sabine River and flooded the bottomland. Whole stretches of blacktop, ditches, culverts, even a few farmhouses and cemeteries slipped under when the water rose. On calm nights, when the lake goes still as glass, some fishermen say you can see headlights drift across the surface like there's still traffic down there. Most brush it off as tricks of moonlight on the chop, or the glow from some boat on the far side, but the men who've really seen it don't laugh when they tell it. I wasn't laughing either the night it came for me. I had been running lines late one October evening, way over near the Louisiana side where the cypress trees thin out and the water runs deep and dark. The weather had turned cold that week, one of those early snaps where the air has bite, but the lake still carries summer warmth and fog rises in slow ribbons. I had been working a trot line strung near the stumps, mostly hoping for catfish but catching more gar than I cared to keep. By the time I checked the last hook, the sun was gone, and the whole reservoir had turned black except for the thin thread of moon tangled in the fog. My outboard sputtered as I idled toward the launch, and I could feel the cold sneaking through my jacket. That's when I saw the light. At first it was faint, just a soft yellow glow maybe 100 yards ahead, like someone holding a lantern, out over the water. I figured maybe another fisherman was working a line or had his camp set up along the bank. But the glow grew stronger and split into two perfect beams, sharp and steady, cutting through the fog at the height of headlights. They weren't bobbing like a lantern on a boat should. They were moving smooth and level, side by side, crossing the water from one side of the cove to the other, and they weren't attached to anything I could see. My first thought was some kids were running a trick, maybe headlights mounted on a John boat to spook drunks. I slowed the motor and listened, but the lake was quiet except for a far-off loon. No engine, no paddles, no laughter, just the steady glide of two beams carving the fog. They didn't fade or flicker. They just rolled along as if the old highway was still there beneath them, leading from one drowned bank to the other. My stomach tightened when I realized the path lined up almost exactly with where the county map showed the old roadbed lying under the water. The lights reached the middle of the cove and then slowed as if a car had stopped dead in the road. For a moment the beams hung in the mist, frozen. Then the fog behind them lit up, red this time, twin brake lights glowing bright and bloody, reflecting on the black water. The whole lake seemed to pulse with that color, and I swear I felt it in my chest like a heartbeat. My hands were shaking on the tiller. I told myself I was overtired, that my eyes were playing tricks. But I knew better. I had heard stories from old-timers about this drowned crossing, whispers about seeing cars in the water long after the road was gone. I wanted to crank the throttle and get back to the ramp, but curiosity rooted me there. I drifted with the motor idling as the red lights dimmed and then flared again, almost like the car down there was tapping its brakes. Then the whole glow began to sink, slow and steady, dropping beneath the surface without a ripple. 1 second it was there. The next it was gone, swallowed by the black lake. The fog closed in as if it had never happened. I sat there long enough that the chill soaked into my bones. Finally, I spun the boat and pushed for shore, too rattled to finish pulling the line. I told myself I'd keep it to myself, but you can't keep something like that bottled up. A week later, over beer at a bait shop outside Hemphill, I mentioned it to an old guide named Leroy. He just nodded like I'd confirmed something he'd known his whole life. That was the bridge, he said. Old farm road ran straight through there before they flooded it. Folks used to wreck there. Lot of them didn't come back up when the water rose. Some nights they're still crossing. The way he said it gave me gooseflesh worse than seeing the lights. He told me divers working for the county had gone down there years back, trying to retrieve a truck that slid in from the boat ramp. Said they found the truck, sure enough. But they also found another car upside down on the roadbed, doors rusted shut, skeletons still strapped inside. The highway was all cracked and mossy, but it stretched out like it still had somewhere to go. Leroy swore he saw one of the divers quit right after that, refused to go back under Toledo Bend. For weeks, I dreamed of red lights glowing underwater. In one dream, I was the one behind the wheel, pressing the brakes too late, sliding into blackness as the water rushed over the windshield. In another, I was standing on the surface, watching cars crawl beneath me like fish. I stopped fishing, that side of the reservoir, but it didn't matter. Sometimes, even on the Texas side where the banks sloped gentle, I'd catch a glimpse of twin beams drifting across the fog. Once, I swear I heard tires on asphalt, faint as a memory, right before the motor cut out on me for no reason. The worst was last spring. I had driven down near the dam late at night, restless, trying to shake the feeling the dreams had left. I pulled over at a turnout, where you can see the expanse of water stretched wide and flat. No boats, no noise but wind. The moon was full and riding high, bright enough to show every shimmer. That's when I saw the line of lights again, only this time there were more than one pair. 4, 6, maybe 8 sets, spaced apart just like cars in a convoy, moving slow and patient across the water in a place no road had ever run. They glowed white, then red, white again, headlights and brake lights, steady as a funeral procession. I could see shapes in the mist too, boxy outlines of cars from decades back, long steel bodies like ghosts. They moved in silence, and then, one by one, they began to sink, leaving nothing but a churn of fog. I don't drive those back roads anymore at night. I don't fish Toledo Bend much either, because I know if I ever get too close, if I ever stop, where the drowned crossing waits, those lights might not just drift past me, they might pull me in, and if they do, nobody will ever find me, except maybe some diver years from now, tugging open a rusted door to find me still gripping the wheel, brake lights glowing faint in the dark, waiting forever on a road that no longer exists. The road between Pecos and Fort Stockton has a way of emptying out the world around you. Mile after mile of caliche dust, sun-bleached yucca, and scrub that trembles in the heat shimmer. If you take the old ranch road that peels off toward Rust Creek, you'll find a forgotten cemetery tucked behind mesquite and barbed wire, its gate hanging half off the post. I came across it one September when I was working a short fencing job on a spread just north of there. The ranch hands had told me about it over beers in Pecos, laughing but not really laughing, warning me not to hang around there past sundown. They said the stones had been sinking for years, every single one lower in the earth than the season before, like the ground was eating them. They said you could hear it at night if you listened, a dragging, sucking sound under the dirt, and more than one cowboy swore he saw pale shapes slipping just below the weeds. When I first went out there, the sun was still high, but already dull, with that dim yellow edge it gets in West Texas when the day is dying. The gate was bent enough that I had to sidestep through, my jeans catching rust and dry grass. Inside, the ground was uneven, not like weather erosion, but like it had been pulled from underneath. The headstones leaned at different angles, some only a few inches above the earth. Names were half hidden, dates swallowed. The ground wasn't soft, though. It was hard-packed caliche and clay, but the stones looked like they were being pulled down anyway, not pushed by time or weather. I knelt to brush the dirt off one that was nearly flat to the earth and felt something shift beneath, like the ground had exhaled against my palm. I stood back quick, heart beating harder than it should have for something so small, and told myself it was nothing more than heat and imagination. Still, the place had that silence you don't trust, the kind that makes you look over your shoulder even when you know no one's there. Rust Creek itself was dry, a gash of stone and tumbleweed, but you could hear water if you stood still long enough, a trickle just out of reach like it was running under the graves instead of beside them. When the wind shifted, I swear I heard the faintest sound of voices, not clear words, just low groans rising from under the dirt like cattle caught in mud. I left before the sun set, walked back to my truck and tried not to look at the leaning mesquite casting their long shadows across the barbed wire. The next week, I asked one of the older ranch hands about it, a man named Cal who'd been riding that country since the 70s. He didn't smile when I brought it up, just lit another cigarette and stared at the dust around his boots. He said the cemetery wasn't meant to be there, not really. Back when the railroad cut through, a handful of workers died in a collapse and they buried them quick in the shallow ground because nobody wanted to haul bodies back to town in the heat. A few years later, the town preachers decided to sanctify the place, put up stones, call it a cemetery proper. But Cal said it never took. He said the land wasn't empty under there, that something moved below, something that pulled down whatever rested on it. He told me one boy back in '92 went missing after daring his friends to spend the night by the fence. All they ever found was his bedroll tangled in the brush by the gate, dirt scattered like something had dragged across it. I thought about that boy a lot when I drove out again, this time just to see if the stones had sunk further. It was only a few weeks, but they looked different. Lower somehow, the earth tighter around them like they were being pulled into the soil. One grave near the far edge, marked only by a plain cross of cedar wood, was gone altogether. Just a shallow depression in the dirt remained, as if the ground had closed itself over what it wanted. The sound of trickling water was louder that evening, almost clear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if I pressed my ear to the ground, I'd hear voices rising up from wherever that current ran. I left fast, but not fast enough to miss, the way the last of the daylight caught on something pale down in one of the depressions, not stone, not wood, something softer. I told myself it was bone from a coyote kill, but I didn't stop to check. Over the months, I drove past less and less, but the place stayed with me. Every now and then, one of the hands would mention it after a long night of drinking. They said cattle avoided the fence line near the graves, pressing tight against each other and bawling until they were driven away. One man claimed he saw a cow's leg sink into the ground up to the hock and take near half an hour to pull free, hide torn and bloody from the effort. Another swore he heard knocking under the dirt when he sat too close on a lunch break, like something trying to get out. No one laughed much when they told it, though, and no one lingered near Rust Creek after dark. I don't know why I went back the last time. Maybe curiosity, maybe stubbornness, maybe the same stupid instinct that makes folks slow down for wrecks on the highway. It was just after a thunderstorm, the kind that turns the desert mud black and heavy, the mesquite dripping, with water and the sky cut open with pink lightning fading toward the horizon. I parked off the road and walked in through the sagging gate, and for the first time the ground didn't feel hard. It was soft, slick with mud, but not mud like I knew. It clung too much, pulled at my boots like hands. The graves were nearly gone, most of the stones completely swallowed. The sound of water wasn't faint anymore, it was rushing, steady like a river deep beneath me, and the air stank of wet earth and something else, something sour like meat left in the sun. I heard it then, plain as anything, voices rising under the mud. Not groans, not whispers, but the sound of men calling out, layered voices echoing from below. I froze, too scared to run, and the ground under me shifted, sagging like a soaked mattress. Something pressed upward from beneath, swelling, the mud into a mound at my feet. I backed toward the gate, boots sucking at each step, when the mound split open just enough to show me the pale curve of a face beneath, water bubbling up around it. Not bone, not statue, but flesh, sagging and wet. The eyes rolled white, and the mouth opened, spilling dark water across the ground before it slid back down, the mud swallowing it whole again. I didn't remember crossing the gate, only stumbling to my truck with mud clinging to my hands, the stink of it filling my nose. I drove back to Pecos without looking in the mirror, certain that if I did, I'd see more faces pressing up from the bed of my truck, dripping water across the tailgate. I've never gone back, though I know the graves are gone now, pulled under by whatever runs beneath Rust Creek. The ranch hands don't talk about it anymore, not even drunk. Some things sink deeper when you name them, just like those stones, and maybe that's the way of it out there. The land doesn't give back what it takes. It just pulls it down and waits for the next fool to lean too close. I moved back to Kerrville the year my mother's knees turned to glass and climbing the porch steps became a two-handed job. The town felt smaller than I remembered. Sidney Baker still cut through like a spine. HEB still flooded its parking lot with fluorescent light at all hours, and the Guadalupe still slid smooth and green past the pecan trees like a secret that never had to be told. Everything else had shifted a half inch. People bore new creases. Houses I thought would stand forever had fresh boards nailed over windows. I tried to settle in and pretend that the spaces left by the years were just wide enough to breathe through. Took 2 jobs to keep the bills level. Days I stocked feed at a ranch supply on Junction Highway and pretended my back still belonged to a younger man. Nights I kept an eye on the small rodeo grounds tucked behind the oak windbreak on the west edge of town. That job wasn't much. Lock the front chain, make sure nobody cut through the pens to run 4-wheelers in the arena, chase off high school kids and bored drifters. I got it because my Uncle Ray used to contract stock there and he vouched for me with the board. He did it on the phone, and I could hear a swallow of whiskey between sentences. He still had the old stock contractor's rasp, like his windpipe had been sanded down by dust and stories. He told me something else on that call. He said I should carry a flashlight with some weight to it and bring a thermos even if I wasn't thirsty. He said if I heard the gate start banging, I shouldn't pretend it was the wind. He said it in the loose way of a man who wanted to warn me without believing in warnings. People in town said those grounds were wrong at night. It was the wrong that sits quiet until you stop talking. I'd heard versions of that since I was a kid. 2 in the morning was the hour they loved to say. Bull gates clanging one by one when nobody touched them. The hush afterward so firm your own breath sounded like a trespass. Dirt lifting in spirals as if a 2,000-pound bull were turning circles, waiting for a rider dumb enough to drop into its shadow. Everyone had a name for the rider that died there. Larkin or Larson or Larkin again, depending on who told it. The older men would say his first name carefully and then act like his death was a knot in a rope you should never pick at. The first week I worked nights, nothing happened. I parked my truck by the concession stand, took a slow walk around the pens and circled back to sit on the narrow bleacher just above the chutes. The boards were worn smooth by decades of jeans. Beneath me, the chutes made a steady line of metal mouths. I could imagine the bulls wedged tight in there, shoulders braced, breath snorting steam, flank straps cinched, the slow step forward to the gate. I could hear the phantom ring of spurs on steel and the way a rider's hand slaps his, rope for grip before he nods. There's a smell that belongs to arenas like that, not just manure and dust. It is heat pressed into planks, drowned in old coke and spilled beer, worked into the splinters by boots. It is rosin and leather and the sour human flavor that never leaves wood once it is soaked in. The second week, the wind pivoted to the north and the temperature pulled down at dusk. The cedar smelled green and sharp. I brought a thermos of coffee and my mother's cinnamon bread wrapped in foil. I did my walk. I paused at the outgate where the alley met the pen and checked the chain. I ran my hand along the top rail. There was a groove there notched into the pipe, and for a second I pictured a horn hitting that spot at speed. Burrs screeching, paint grinding away to bare metal. It was just a thought until my fingers found tiny ridges, as if something had filed the groove in with desperate repetition. That theory sat heavy enough in my head that I had to walk away to quiet it. They say the clang of metal carries farther, at night. I had just poured coffee into the lid when the first bang came. It was not the slap of loose tin. It was the signature sound of a bucking chute gate thrown wide and crashing back against its stopper. That noise is part engineering and part theater and part violence. You cannot mistake it for anything else once you know it. I stood there with the coffee lid in my hand and listened to the echo run along the bleachers and die in the field behind the arena like a stone skittering to rest. A second gate banged open, 3 chutes down. A third followed it. The rhythm was wrong. It did not sound like horses in the return alley, or men opening and closing chutes to sort stock. It sounded like a roll call. I set the coffee down too. Fast, and a brown crescent ran toward my knuckles and burned. There was no wind on the arena floor, yet dust rose in a slow ribbon. It lifted like something exhaled below it. A tight circle formed near the center. I could see the rim deepen as if a hoof pressed into the dirt and turned again. The smell came with it, a wet heat with a sour edge that caught in your sinuses. I had known bulls up close, and that smell had weight in it. I wanted to tell myself I was watching a trick of temperature, some inversion that made dust behave wrong. I wanted to say a raccoon had scrambled under the bleachers and rattled the gates with its weight. Those hopes evaporated when the dust circle began to move toward the fence as if a body had shifted its shoulders and changed direction. The hair on my arms climbed. I could not shake the sense that something was not just acting like a bull, but angry with the same usefulness a bull has. A live bull will test the world with its horns to see what holds. I felt that testing settling on me. Footsteps sounded in the bleachers 2 rows up and to my right. I turned with a quickness that made my neck click and saw the figure that every version of the story keeps at the edges. He wore a wide brim that shadowed his eyes. His right hand held a bull rope looped in a neat coil. He had the rigid stillness of a man standing for a photograph, but the air around him pulled tight, as if his shape took more room than his body. He was too far away for me to make out his face. I'm glad of that. I said a word that meant both, greeting and warning, and he did not answer. The gates down the line banged again, a cascade of metal calls, and the dust circle met the fence and slid along it like an animal looking for a break. I thought of a bull finding the outgate without bothering to see the man on the fence. When the second cascade of gates hit, I ran. I carried the thermos like a talisman and my flashlight like a club. I climbed the chain at the entrance and dropped harder than I should have, my knees complaining. I did not turn my back long enough to offer it in any single direction. I kept, expecting a weight to thud behind me and a breath to rush my neck. I got in my truck, shut the door, and let the steel be steel. The sound of the engine made the world normal enough for me to drive away and pretend the gates were not still calling in the dark behind me. I told myself I would quit. I told myself that there were other men who could keep a chain on a gate, and I had done my time in night places. Then I woke the next morning and heard my mother humming in the kitchen like she always did when the pain hit in waves, and I understood that I could not refuse a second paycheck and pretend we would be fine. I went back the following night and, because a man will often pretend he does a brave thing in small steps, I kept the headlights on the arena and sat in the cab with the windows cracked just enough to catch the air. For an hour, there was nothing. After that, the radio found a voice. It started as static and then a hiss that formed syllables. The old CB set mounted under the dash had not worked in a year. It was for show now, a nod to the way my uncle kept it bolted in place and used to bless his drives with curses sent to strangers. The speaker coughed and then a male voice spoke as if from the far end of a tube. He was not on a frequency I could scroll to. He spoke a rodeo announcer's rhythm, the kind that hangs on a name and rides it. He said welcome to the Hill Country Rodeo in a breath that had dust in it. He pulled the town out long in his mouth to show he knew it. He introduced a bull that was not on any sheet I had seen in the office. He called it coal sack. He said it with an affection that was almost reverent. He asked if the rider was ready. The question hung open in the cab. I did not speak. The voice paused as if listening for a nod, and then the speaker crackled with a bang that was not from my truck's doors. I turned off the radio. The voice kept talking a half second after the power died. That was the half second that set something in place in me. During the day, I started asking quiet questions. Not the kind that mark you as a man looking for ghosts, just enough to gather the edges. At the feed store, an old rancher named Garner, who wore a felt hat even through August heat, told me his brother had been in the stands the night Larkin died. He insisted the bull was named Kalish or Comanche or something else with a hard C. He said the horn came clean and simple without gore. He said that made it worse. He said the bull kept circling after, nose low to the ground as if not understanding what it had done. At the HEB, the woman who cut pork chops behind the glass told me that her daddy had pulled the outgate that night, and he said he still woke up with the clang in his ears 3 times a year, same dates every time, and he would check his calendar and shake his head. At the library, a woman named Eloise with silver hair and a voice like bandage tape led me to a cabinet full of microfilm and cranked the handle. The Kerrville Daily Times from August 1973 gave me a stock photo of a smiling young man in a hat and half a paragraph about a tragic accident at local rodeo grounds. It did not name the bull. It did not describe what his chest looked like after. It did not need to. I found a picture I had not been looking for on a dusty bulletin board in the office behind the concession stand. Torn newspaper, thumbtacked under, a flyer for a benefit barbecue in a year I did not remember. The photograph showed a rider leaving the chute. You could see his free hand high, the glove flared white against a black bull's hump. The rope wrapped his riding hand so tight that the leather looked like skin. The bull's head was turned, one horn catching light, and that horn had something wrong at the tip. The steel was scraped, and there was a ragged edge as if the point had once been broken and grown back into a bird hook. There was a name burned into the leather flank strap in the left-hand bottom of the picture. C was the first letter. The rest of the strap was shadow. That night, I watched again. I wanted to prove to myself that the night of the gates had been the peak, and that whatever remained would be the echo of a story I had primed myself to hear. I poured coffee. I sat on the second row above the chutes. The air was still enough to feel like holding your breath. The speaker under my dash remained quiet. The first bang did not surprise me. The second and third linked to it like train cars. The dust circle rose on the center line again and turned as if drawn by a rope. I did not run this time. I did a foolish thing instead. I climbed down the bleacher and stepped inside the fence. The dirt on that floor holds so many years that it behaves like a memory. Layers pack hard, then soften, then sift. I stood in that mix and the smell rang me like a bell. It grabbed a deep part of my brain and shook it. I told myself to move slowly. I told myself not to show a back or walk in a straight line. I turned in place, and the dust circle adjusted as if I were a magnet and it was a compass needle. It came closer by inches. The gates that stood open down the chute line clanged shut by their own weight, and then banged wide again as if opened by a hand. I realized my own breath had gone hard and fast. I realized the world had gone empty of sound except the metal and the dirt and my heart. There is a second kind of wrong that sits deeper than fear. It is the knowledge that something is insisting on your attention, and you have no polite way to deny it without consequence. The dust circle moved within a yard of my boots and stopped. I could feel a pressure that had nothing to do with air. It was like standing in front of a speaker with the bass turned to a private note. The board on the rail beside me creaked and I saw a scuff appear where none had been. It was the scuff a horn makes when a proud head bristles against wood. Another scuff joined it at a different height. I said an apology to a man I had never met and I yielded my place to the fence. I stepped back carefully, climbed slowly and returned to the bleachers with the knowing of a coward and a livable pulse. When I turned to look at the far end of the stands, the figure stood there again. This time I could see more than hat and rope. I could see that his shirt had the dull, inky sheen of cloth washed and hung 100 times. I could see the shape of his cheek. I could not see his eyes. The brim held that gift back. I started dreaming of gates. In the dreams, the clang would come from a room I could never fully enter. I would find myself looping the chain and stepping away to hear it fall and then bang back again with nobody there. In the day, the dreams left behind a residue. The noise would echo in my jaws if I had clenched my teeth all night. Once or twice I woke and touched my chest because there was a phantom ache there, like a bruise pressed under bone. My mother noticed I had gotten strange. She asked me twice at breakfast if I was sleeping. She asked me once if I had met a woman because I was walking around like a man who had both found and lost something. I blamed it on long shifts and bad coffee. She nodded the way a woman nods when she decides to let a man lie to himself. I made the mistake of telling Sheriff Donnie Ricks that the chain needed a new padlock. He insisted on driving out to see for himself. He is a big man who knows how to act bigger. He wore his hat like a badge. He parked crooked and walked with his thumbs tucked in his belt as if his hands did not know what else to do. I unlocked the chain because he said walk me around, and we moved through the pens with me talking about hinges and he talking about county budgets in the tone a man uses who has never told a secret aloud in his life. When the first gate banged, he stopped in mid-sentence. He said what the hell one time and then not again. His face went white around the mouth. He turned his head toward the arena floor and watched the dust lift, and he said nothing at all. The second cascade of gates sounded, and he drew his shoulders in like a man trying not to be picked from a crowd. Then he said his budget meetings did not cover ghosts and that if the chain was good and I could keep the kids out, he would be obliged. He did not walk back to the truck. He moved like a man expecting a slick of oil under his boot might carry him. A few nights later, I heard laughter in the stands behind me and turned to see 4 high school boys perched on the top row. 2 had baseball caps, 1 had hair that made defiance out of curls, and the last had a boy's mustache that wanted to be grown. They had snuck in by the mesquite on the far side, and they had beers up their sleeves. I told them to go, and they told me I should go with them, and then the gates took over the conversation. The first clang knocked every joke out of their mouths. The second pulled them to their feet. The dust rose slow and heavy like an explanation you do not want but cannot argue with. One boy swore once in a whisper. Another said he could not breathe. Right, and I watched his chest flutter like a trapped bird. I walked them past the concession stand with a hand on the back of the one with the mustache, and I had to tell him twice that no, we were not going to see what made the sound. They left quietly and did not throw their beer cans into the brush. That felt like respect. I went to see a woman named Mara because Eloise at the library said the widow still lived 2 streets over from the river. She had been Mara Larkin once. She opened her door with caution in the space between evening and night, where you can believe anything that knocks. I told her my name like it meant something. I told her my uncle had worked stock there. I told her what I heard. She did not invite me in. She stood in the doorway and tapped the edge of it with one nail as if adding up numbers for a bill. Then, she said that James had a way of standing in line that made you believe he knew how the ride was going to end, and that he would handle it no matter what. She said he had a buckle he won at Fredericksburg that he wore even when he painted the little rental house they had because it kept his jeans up and made him feel less like a man pruning roses. She said the bull's name had been Coalsack even if the papers got it wrong, and that it had only thrown 2 men before that night, and that sometimes you think the odds are on your side because you cannot understand the kind of math that takes breath away. She stopped tapping, her voice flattened. She said the arena sounds like it still has a job to do. She said you should not stand in the dirt and ask to be part of it. I wanted to tell her I had already stood there. Instead, I asked if she had any photographs. She shook her head once. She asked me if anyone still lit the lantern in the announcer's booth during storms to keep the water from running through the wires. I said I did not know. She nodded and closed the door and left me on the porch with the smell of river and wet pecans lifting off the yard. At some point, my curiosity turned into purpose, and the change felt like dropping into a deeper part of the river. The voice on the radio came back with a better connection one night when the clouds threatened rain. He called out names of town sponsors that had not put up money in decades. He said the outgate would need oil before Saturday, and he made a joke about a clown named Amos who had a nose like a cherry and a way with kids. He said, "Good to see you again," in a tone too full to be general, and then he said my name like it was part of his script. He said it right. There are 2 ways to say my name wrong. He picked the 3rd way that is mine and belongs to people who knew my father, and the way he said it made my mouth go dry. I tried to think like a man could fix a thing. The grounds had some electricity, but the announcer's booth was mostly dead. I brought a lantern the way Mara had asked about, and I lit it there to keep the rain out of wires that had already surrendered. I found a drawer with ribbon rosettes and pins and a felt hatband that had turned to a stiff ring. I found a belt buckle with a steer head on it and the words, Fredericksburg 72 etched around the brim. I did not take it. I held it by its tongue and then put it back down, facing the way it had faced. I did not pass that test. The buckle reappeared later in my truck wrapped in a rag that smelled like cedar and old smoke. I do not know how it got there. I would say I do not want to know, but that is not true. I want to know every part of how, and I am afraid that asking will make the voice on the radio clearer and the gates more eager. I began to notice a pattern. The gates banged on nights when the wind came toward town from the west and drove the smell of cedar through the oaks. They banged on the second night after a rain when the dirt had just enough crust to lift in sheets. They did not bang on Sundays unless a storm was running the edge of the county and lightning was too far to hear. I do not pretend it was science. I pretended it was respect. When those nights lined up, I did not sit in the cab. I sat in the bleachers with the buckle in my pocket and my flashlight on my thigh, and I listened. On the last night that even now I can tell cleanly, I decided to step into the center. Not because I believed I had a power to fix anything, but because a man can only circle a thing that insists for so long before he either leaves town and calls himself smart or steps in and calls himself honest. The wind had the right angle. The concession sign creaked once and then held. The outgate chain hung slack. I climbed the fence and dropped inside the arena. I leaned my back against the rail and took a breath. Then I walked across the dirt to the place where the circle always began to lift. The gates banged one by one as if counting paces. I reached the center and the dust rose. It climbed up to my shins as if testing the height of me. I took the buckle out of my pocket and held it chest high. I said the dead man's first name. I said it carefully. I told him I had something and that he, or the shape of him left in the sound of this place, could take it back. The dust climbed higher. I held the buckle out with my palm up and did not move my arm. My fingers shook and I forced them to stillness by thinking of my mother's hand on mine when she taught me to carry a brimming cup without spilling. The dust formed around the buckle the way water grabs a flat stone. It pressed and the weight of it surprised me, and then it took the buckle light as the memory of a hat tossed to a friend, and the buckle did not fall to the ground. It hung in air a foot in front of me. It turned once like a man's hand had turned it to see the back, and then it vanished. It did not drop. I did not hear it hit. The dust collapsed. Silence took every seat. I did not move because there is a moment after the most frightening thing happens where you can hear your body rebuilding the lie that everything is fine. The lie had not found its words when something hit my chest. It was force without object. It was the quick jerk a bull gives to test a rope before committing itself to the hard move. It lifted me half a step back and my boot slid in the dirt, and my planted heel saved me from sitting down in fear. Something grazed my sternum. It was a burn and a cold at once. I crouched and balled one hand into the dirt because that felt like the only respectful answer. Then the smell rolled over me in a wet wave. I heard the low sound again, the one that settled into bones. It had a shape now. It was a breath that knew my name. I stood with care and backed toward the rail with care and said thank you to air that had not replaced the buckle with weight. I got to the fence and climbed. Halfway up, a horn brushed the denim over my calf. The fabric did not tear. The pressure had deliberateness in it. It said I could if I wanted. I swung a leg over and dropped. I backed up the bleacher steps until I stood again where I had always stood. I was breathing fast and I was not ashamed of it. The far end of the stands held shape. The rider stood there with his rope in his hand. Something silver glinted at his hip. I did not need to be told what it was. He lifted his free hand slowly as if to settle a spook in a horse and then lowered it again. The gates banged shut like a final statement. Later at home, when I undressed for a shower, my chest showed a crescent of skin where the hair was singed away. The skin below it had a raised welt the width of my thumb, a straight line as if pressed by metal. The curve above and the line below made the shape of a hooked thing. I wanted to say I had done it leaning against a hot pipe in the office, or burned myself on the edge of a thermos. The shape refused those excuses. I put on a shirt and buttoned it to the top and stood in the bathroom and felt the house's old boards creak and wondered whether even a house could be told the truth. The next day, a package lay on the cushion of my truck seat. It was wrapped in brown paper. There was no postage. Inside was a glossy 8x10 photograph and nothing else. The photograph showed the rider slipping his hand into the rope in the chute. You could see only the back of his head and the slope of his shoulder. The bucking chute gate stood shut. The bull in the paper stood calm, head low, neck wrinkled. The flank strap did not yet bite. On the bottom corner, someone had written in, ballpoint James. The loop of the J told you a woman had written it. I put the photograph back in the envelope and put the envelope under the seat. I did not have a plan for a thing like that. I lasted another month at that job. The sheriff never came back, the boys with the beer never did either. In that month, the gates clanged on their nights and the dust circle found my boots and then changed its mind. The voice on the radio said my name 2 more times, and once he laughed at a joke about a clown I could not hear. I did not step into the arena again. I did not take back the buckle. I did not offer any more. All I did was sit and listen and say the rider's name when the wind got tight enough to squeeze sound thin. There are places that make a copy of you when you stand inside them. The copy is not a ghost and not a regret. It is just a shape of you made of dust and attention that lingers. I think the rodeo grounds keep copies. I think the stands hold rows of men made of the things they wanted to be braver about. I think the gates have learned the way to call those men to their feet and ask for one more nod. I think one of those men is me. By Christmas, my mother's legs had improved enough to make the steps again with a hand on the rail. I told the board I was done with nights. They pried at me with the kind of jokes men use when they want a story, and they do not want to say, they want it. I gave them nothing. The board president said I must have a girl. I let him have that because what harm would it do to be called a liar for a soft reason? On my last night, I poured coffee and sat in the bleachers. The wind chose a direction that meant quiet. No gates banged. The announcer's booth kept its glass reflections to itself. I said the name one more time and thanked him for not killing
me. I don't go by there at night now. I change my route if I have to. That is the only way I know to keep the shape of myself whole. Still, sometimes, when I am closing the feed store and the evening is just pushing through the door, I will
hear a faraway metal sound, and my jaw will tighten with a memory that does not want to be called that. Occasionally on Saturdays, the small circuit still holds a show out there. Young men with bones that have not yet heard their first real answer pull old ropes tight and call the names of bulls bred since that bull. The crowd is small. The cotton candy is stale. Sometimes the clown does a trick with a dog that makes the kids clap like their hands invented the idea. On those days, If you stand by the fence and squint into the alley, you will see a man in a hat that throws his eyes into, shade watching from the back of the chutes. He is not on the roster. He nods when a rider nods. He flinches when the ride ends badly. He disappears when you look twice. The last time I went to the grounds in daylight, I found the office clean in a way that said somebody new had a set of keys and a sense of pride. The bulletin board had been cleared. The drawer with the ribbons had been sorted. The announcer's booth had a fresh lick of paint. Beside the window where the microphone used to be, someone had nailed up a hook to hang a lantern. The hook was new. The lantern wasn't there. When I turned to go, I saw a small framed thing on the wall by the door. It was not big enough to hold a certificate. It held a buckle on a piece of cord. The buckle showed a steer head and the word Fredericksburg and the year that rusted 2 in a curl that might have been a 3. I do not believe in the kind of luck that would put that there. I touched the glass and it felt cold and then hot. If you drive past on a night the wind has its mind made up, if you cut your headlights and roll to the chain and listen, what you will hear first is your own engine going soft into tick sounds, and then a full breath taken by a place that is not empty. Then the metal will bang a greeting. Then the dirt will say, I am here and I can hold you or I can keep you. You might decide that a story is only a shape laid over a set of noises and smells to help a town sleep. You might decide that the dead man on the bleachers is a picture made by your own wish to be the kind of person who walks close to danger and returns with a sentence to show for it. You might say your name out loud to test whether the radio knows it. I hope it does not. I hope the voice never learns how to say you. If it does, it will say you right. It will turn its tongue around the parts that only people from here know. It will set your name on the rail like a hat, and the gates will open one by one in the dark, and a circle of dirt will lift, and all your brave parts will stand, and the arena will count you among the men it keeps. The panhandle always sounded lonely, like the land itself kept sighing because there wasn't enough out here to hold it together. Out by the frost place, where the wire cut a ruler-straight seam across wheat stubble and exhausted cotton rows, that sigh turned to music when the wind found the barbs. It was never pure wind noise. It carried a pitch that sank into your ear the way the smell of creosote soaks into a jacket. You could pretend it was nothing until your hands were on a staple gun and your cheek was near the wire, and then the note would shift, and it wasn't a note at all so much as a breath on the other side, steady and patient, waiting for you to understand what a line can mean to the thing on the far side of it. I was 29 that winter, 2 bad knees from high school football and one worse habit of saying yes to night work nobody else wanted. The Frost family needed someone to walk the northern stretch after they started finding their cattle against the fence with the kind of wounds people don't like to describe at church. It was the sort of job you take to prove you're still useful, and if there was a little extra cash under the table, I wasn't too proud to take that either. I had a bunkhouse room 3 miles south of the county line, a truck older than me, and a rifle with a loose rear sight that shot left when the cold made the barrel ring. I told myself it would be coyotes, or a cat pressing down from the caprock, something with a meat reason. I told myself that right up until I put a gloved hand on a frosted T-post and felt it tremble like a throat. The first cow I found was a black, bald-faced cross, 2 years old, good weight. She lay neatly parallel to the fence with her rump against the bottom strand, as if she had lain down to rest. Her hide was parted from the brisket to the flank without the tearing I knew from predator work. The ribs were clean and shining in a way that made them look like handles. There wasn't much blood on the ground. There was hair ribboned on 3 barbs like someone had decorated for a dance and lost interest partway. The tracks around her were wrong. Not pads, not hooves. Scuffs that didn't point any direction. If you've ever looked at a polished concrete floor after a crowd, you know the feeling. All the motion is there, but none of it makes sense. I called Dale. He came out with his old man's Winchester and a thermos, and we stood with coffee smoke, coming off our breath while the wire hummed and the dead cow's eye caught a smear of sunrise. Dale had the look the winter had given every man that season. Chapped skin, a crack along the bottom lip that never closed, shoulders rounding as if the cold pushed down from above. He didn't talk much, but he'd grown up with that fence, the Way boys in town grew up with sidewalks, and he kept turning his head like a bird, listening for something he didn't want to admit he heard. "We had a vet out last week," he said finally. He said blade work, said maybe kids with knives or a thief who spooks easy and just takes the organs he knows he can sell in a hurry. I didn't argue, but I don't know a kid who can make a cut that clean with gloves on in this cold and not leave tracks. I looked at the barbs glittering with hoarfrost and the way the wire made a low, steady sound when the norther pressed through the mesquite break. I wanted to say it was tricks of temperature. I wanted to say a lot of safe things. Instead, I said I would walk the line from the windmill pasture to the county road every night for a week, and in daylight if the weather looked like it wanted to go bad. From the bunkhouse, the fence ran like the staff lines on sheet music nobody had finished writing. It crossed caliche and old stream beds, skirted the knob where tornadoes like to lift, and cut a straight scar across winter wheat that had never come in full. The wind found it the way sound finds a bottle rim. If the air was steady out of the north, the pitch settled deep until it worked through the ground into your boots. If the air came gusting off the west, it jumped like a plucked wire and tingled up the hand that rested on it. After the second night, I carried leather gloves not just for the barbs, but because the steel was so cold it burned. Nothing living moves silently in the panhandle. Even a coyote makes sand whisper. That week, I kept hearing a glide that didn't match anything I knew. I would freeze and swing the light and see a suggestion 30 yards beyond the fence. Something the color of fence posts against sky. Too tall to be a cat, too thin to be a man who had grown up under the same sun I had. When I took a step, the wire would sing a higher note, and whatever it was would reach the mesquite and be only branches. I told myself if I was seeing things, it was because the wind made tears, and the tears froze in a certain pattern at the corners of your eyes. On Thursday, I brought a recorder I kept for coyotes. It was an old box that took big batteries and had a hiss no matter what you did. I set it near a brace where the hum was strongest and let it run while I walked the mile to the road. The cattle bunched near the windmill and watched me pass with heads out. That dull fear they wear in their eyes when weather is wrong. When I came back, the recorder had shut itself off. The little tape spool was spun to the middle and warm to the touch in a way that made no sense. Back at the bunkhouse, I played it. I'd been hoping for the long note, something to prove I wasn't getting superstitious. Instead, I heard breathing that wasn't mine, long pulls that made the mic diaphragm click at the end of each exhale. I heard the soft sound a knife makes when it slides through cloth. In the last seconds, I heard my own footfalls coming back, down the fence, and then the click of me shutting it off, except I hadn't touched it. I took the batteries out and put the cassette in my tool chest where I wouldn't have to see it, and I told myself I was leaving it there because I didn't want it to get dusty. It snowed Friday night, the kind of powder that erases detail and makes a man think the world is clean. I strapped on my headlamp and went out anyway because you don't call a rancher in the panhandle and tell him you skipped the night check due to pretty snow. I walked with the lamp bouncing cold light and watched my breath pour in front of my face like a train exhaust. The fence sang high and thin. The sound buried itself in the snow and came back up near my knees. The cattle stood out black against the drifted white, and for the first time that week, the pasture felt lit, as if light could close up the empty places where dark things gather. There were tracks on the far side, nothing I knew, just shallow scallops a hand's breadth apart, marching in a line that paid no attention to the dips and humps of the ground. I put my lamp on the lowest setting and followed. The wind dropped. The world stepped into that hollow quiet it gets right before the barometer breaks. I rounded a bend in the wire where a dead man anchor from the 60s had sunk into the dirt until the crosspiece was only a black smear, and I saw a figure ahead leaning over the strand. It looked like a man wearing a feed store coat, skinny as a colt, hat pulled low. He had one hand on the barb and one hand reaching through to the cattle side. He didn't flinch when the barb bit the glove. He didn't bleed. He didn't scent like a person. He smelled like wet iron and the first dust that comes off a cattle guard when you drive across it in June. "Hey," I said, and it came out too loud and too small all at once. "You can't be out here." He stood. He turned. The wind shifted and made the wire catch a note that slid across my teeth. He had a face the way fence has a face, just suggestion and angle and the idea of eyes. When he moved away from the fence, he didn't make the sound a body makes in snow. The barbs he had touched were rimed with a new glitter, not frost, but something that reflected light the way fish scales do at night. He glided into the mesquite, and the mesquite accepted him the way water accepts a hand. The next morning, 3 heifers lay in a neat stagger along the line, all of them opened from throat to belly, no tracks in the fresh powder except my own and the wind's. Dale came out and stood with his shoulders hunched while I pulled tarp over bodies. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He gave me an extra roll of wire and handed me a new pair of gloves still stiff from the packaging, and his hand shook once when he let go of the gloves. The way you shake after a nightmare you can't remember. We both stopped acting like this was about coyotes. We started acting like the line was a thing that needed tending the way you tend a sick relative. We tightened where it sagged. We drove new posts where the old ones had loosened in the freeze. We hung beer cans as poor man's warning bells and watched them twitch on still days. Dale called the sheriff because it was what a man is supposed to do. The sheriff came out and stood with his thumbs in his vest pockets and didn't step close, enough to get the hum in his bones. He looked at the cuts and at the near absence of blood and told us to lock our gates and keep the rifle close. He talked about copycat mutilations, about kids who see a thing on television and want to make their own, about how there are always more footprints than a man sees when he's scared. His breath made fog in front of his face that drifted and thinned and vanished like the rest of his words. He left tracks that filled with blowing grit almost as soon as he drove away. Around that time I started having the dreams about wire, not about walking the fence, not about the frost singing, dreams of standing in the bunkhouse doorway while thousands of strands ran from horizon to horizon, all of them pulled so tight they sang cruel hot notes like guitar strings turned beyond reason. In the dream, my father stood on the hood of our old Chevy with a fencing crimp in each hand. He looked at me without eyes, and the wire sawed through his palms, and he smiled the way a man smiles when a toothache finally breaks and relief is pain's twin. I woke with my hands aching and my jaw stiff from grinding, and my pillow smelled like the metallic stink of pennies after you bite them. I asked old man Harlan about lines. He ran cows 2 sections east and sometimes sat at the diner with the team, men who live by weather. He looked at the frost heaves outside and at the steam coming off his coffee and said every line out here means something that doesn't show on a title. Surveyors ran through and put their little cairns in the wrong places. Families shot at each other over cattle guards. The Dust Bowl taught the county there are lines on a map and there are lines the wind respects. Some of those lines are made from bone and some from memory. He said the frost line had history. He said a homestead from the teens burned in a wind that pushed fire sideways, and a boy died running with wire across his shoulder, and the wire caught a corner of him as he fell and cut him into the ground, and his mother gave the barbs a piece of her hair to keep him from wandering. Harlan wasn't a storyteller. He spat that out like gristle. I didn't know if I believed him, but I started tying clean cloth strips at the braces out of habit. You do what you know. At night, when the wire moaned, the cloths fluttered like hands calling something to pass, harmless. It didn't work. The taking slowed and then came back meaner. The bodies lined themselves up more precisely. The leather of ears stayed untouched, while the muscle of haunches came out like meat from a roast. The barbs collected little gifts I didn't put there. A coin so worn it had no face left. A bit of bootlace tied in a knot a bow hunter would recognize. Once, a baby's plastic ring, the kind you clip to a stroller, bent hard where it must have, been forced through the wire by fingers that didn't understand give. We brought a vet again, not the first one. A woman out of Amarillo, practical to the bone, hair braided tight, hands like a pianist. She spent an hour on her knees in the dirt, scalpel paused, eyes unfocused, not squeamish but listening with her whole body. She finally stood and said it wasn't surgery in the sense the sheriff meant, and it wasn't animals doing what animals do. She said it looked like a complicated tension had been relieved. She said if you've ever unwound a bale so tight the strings twanged, if you've ever cut them and watched the flakes fall apart, then you know how this looked. She rubbed her palms together as if they ached. I thought she might tell us to take the whole fence down. She didn't. She looked at the long straight run and at the places where we had restretched and at the places where posts leaned under history. and she said in a very quiet voice that sometimes a line is less a wall than a bow. She paid me. The oddest compliment I've ever received by saying she trusted my hands to tell the difference. I spent the next week walking with a come-along and a pipe. I would adjust in tiny ways when the note changed, taking tension, giving it back, moving staples a hair, shifting a brace so the pull found a different angle. I stopped thinking about predators and started thinking about tuning. I learned that a half turn on a stay in the south field made a sigh 3 miles north, turned to a kind of breathy whisper that let the cattle feed without their heads jerking up. I learned that if I moved a single staple a 1/4 inch to the left near the windmill, the whole run sat quiet like a dog that had just been spoken to. On the 4th night of that tuning, just past midnight, the blue norther came down like somebody, opening a door on a freezer. The temperature dropped 20 degrees while I was out. The wire sang high, then so high I couldn't hear it but felt it through the bones around my ears. The stars had that diamond clarity they get when the air is killing. The cattle pressed themselves into the lee of the machinery shed and looked small enough to pocket. I was a mile from the bunkhouse when I saw lantern light where there should not have been any. It wasn't the sodium fat of a yard light or the wandering yellow of a truck crawling a ranch road. It was the soft, hungry glow of an old barn light the color of apricots. It came from the line. As I walked closer, the light gathered itself into 4 shapes spaced evenly along the fence. They stood just on the far side. They were the height of men and a little taller, thin enough you could have mistaken them for saplings planted in the wrong soil. Their heads were at a slant. Their shoulders were spare. Their hands extended toward the steel as if waiting for directions. They didn't wear hats and didn't need to. The cold did nothing to them. The wire between them glowed orange where their hands hovered. The barbs had halos like the dull crowns on cheap church statues. Didn't raise the rifle. There are times you come up against a thing you know a gun won't change. I went the other way. I set the pipe. I hooked the puller. I took a 1/4 turn on the nearest stay the way I had been learning to do. The note changed. The light leaned. One of the shapes turned its face to me and opened a mouth that had something like teeth and not enough of them. It felt like a train passing under my feet. The cattle started bawling, one scream from a calf cutting through everything. I took another 1/4 turn and the glow dimmed as if I were depriving a flame of air. The shape nearest me reached and the wire sagged, and the barb took a fold of my coat. The coat held. I got the pipe off by instinct and fell hard on my ass. I don't remember standing. I remember running. I remember the cold air cutting my chest and that beautiful, terrible note lifting behind me into silence. I remember the long, flat of the bunkhouse floor, the warping of the wood near the stove, the way my hand shook when I reached for the coffee tin and made a mess of grounds across the counter. I never did clean up completely. I remember turning up the radio until a preacher out of Childress talked about boundaries and covenants and the sin of moving landmarks. And I had to shut it off because the way he said those words made me certain he had never lived near a fence that could sing you into doing something stupid. 2 days later, we found the first human thing that wasn't a lost coin or a toy. It was a glove. I saw it from a distance because the color was wrong against the dun. It wasn't ranch leather. It was hospital blue, torn at the wrist, dried blood at the fingertips. Inside, there were 4 inches of what had once been a hand, not rotten, not chewed, cleaned. Dale stood with me and we did a thing men have done on plains and in forests and in cities for as long as there have been hands to hold anything. We looked around to make sure we were alone, and we buried that. Glove under a stone, we said nothing. The sheriff came back with a state man who had a fine down jacket and a kindness in his eyes I wanted to mistrust. He asked careful questions, as if words themselves could cross lines if you threw them too hard. He wanted to know about the vet. He wanted to know about the recorder I had put in the tool chest. He wanted to know about the glove and watched our faces when we told him we hadn't seen anything. He did not ask about lights. He did not ask about a humming fence. I saw he had the look of a person who has already decided to live with not knowing. He left a card. He told us to call. He said the frost was breaking and that made men do things they would be sorry for. He said a lot of true things that missed the truth. When the thaw came, the hum deepened. It wasn't louder. It was thicker. It made the space under the house vibrate. It made the dishes align themselves toward the north. I switched on the recorder one morning and laid it on the sill and let it drink a minute of the day. When I played that minute back, there was a bell tone underneath the wind, a pure thing that didn't fit with the rest, and I knew I'd tuned my little stretch until it was part of a bigger instrument someone else was playing. That afternoon I drove to the Canadian River cut to clear my head, and I saw a brace down in the draw that didn't belong to the frost fence. It belonged to the next ranch over, a man named Guevara who had a sense of humor that kept him young and a wife who made pies. His brace was new and wrong. The diagonal lay backward, so the push made the whole corner torque when the line pulled. It made a dish out of the wire instead of a plane. That dish would catch wind and serve it to whatever listened. I pulled into his yard. He wasn't home. His boy was. He stood with his crutches on the porch and watched me like he watched everything. He had been born with a foot turned and had the perfect stillness of a kid who has had to learn his body doesn't always do what other bodies do. I told him to tell his daddy I wanted to swap some help for pie. I went back to my bunkhouse and waited for dark, and when it came, I parked near the draw and listened. The note from Guevara's brace caught mine and turned it into a chord. If you've ever been inside a church when an old organ warms up, or in a gymnasium when 1,000 kids sing the first verse of the anthem without music, you know how a chord, from simple voices, can feel like a change in air pressure. It lifted the hair on my forearms. It made my mouth taste like I had bitten foil. The cattle stopped and faced the wire as one. A line of something tall and almost human stepped from the far side brush and stood with its arms at its sides. I counted 4. Then I had to stop counting because I realized counting is inviting. I knew that the way you know how far away lightning is when you grew up out here and learned what thunder means. I went back to the bunkhouse. I sat at the table with the recorder in front of me and the frost burning at the window, and a memory I didn't ask for rising to my tongue. When I was 8, my father left a strand loose and the wind sang through the yard all night while a neighbor woman lay dying across the county road. My mother said, "Shut that song up." And my father said, "You don't shut music up. You find the right key." He took me out and put my small hands on a stay and turned it until the yard went still, and he said, "Can you feel that?" I lied and said yes because boys lie to please their fathers. Sitting there in the bunkhouse, I finally felt it. We tuned for days. We made small changes because big ones woke whatever waited. Dale worked the South with a care I had never seen him give anything except his youngest child when she had a fever, and slept against his chest while he moved like she was glass. I worked the North. We didn't talk much, the air didn't want voices. The wire did enough speaking for all of us. The cattle quieted, the lights came less. When they came, they stood farther back. I started to think this was the way out. I started to think a man can learn to live with anything if you give him enough small knobs to slide up and down. Then the blue norther came again, this time with ice. It gleamed on the barbs like work a jeweler might have been proud of if he didn't know what it was decorating. The wire sang high and then higher, and then the kind of high that is outside hearing but not outside hurt. The power went out. The pump at the windmill slowed and then kept turning without reason, then stopped in a position no pump stops in, as if the air itself had reached down and said enough. I walked out because I was the man paid to walk out, because I had told myself I could tune away a thing that had lived under this land longer than we had maps, because the cattle needed a person to stand between them and whatever they imagined. I walked with the pipe. I walked with the come-along. I walked with gloves that had holes I had been meaning to patch. I walked with the memory of Harlan's story and with the recorder I had turned on because there is a kind of stupidity that wears a workman's face. The light was already there when I reached the brace, not the warm barn light. The light that looks like it is coming from inside bone. It ran along the wire in a silver rush and pooled at the barbs in droplets that didn't fall. The shape stood behind the line and shifted like a wind nobody else could feel moved through them. There were more of them. They weren't interested in me. They were listening to the wire like cattle listen to a creek they know will freeze by morning. The note went from a thin keen to a broader thing that picked up my ribs and used them. I stepped to the brace and put the pipe on the stay and felt it thrumming. I took a quarter turn. It was the wrong direction. It was such a small mistake, the kind you make in kitchens and in marriages and in fields when you are tired and the air is loud and your hands are colder than you admit. The cord went bright. The shapes leaned. The wire drew tight as if something on both ends had pulled at once. The barb near my left hand moved. It arced a little. It was such a modest movement. It caught the web of my glove and the meat between my finger and thumb. The pain was clean and electric and personal in a way I had not felt since I broke my wrist on a ladder when I was a kid. I yanked without thinking, and the barb didn't let me go. I looked down and saw my hand. Saw the barb, saw my blood making a thin dark V on black steel, and I understood a thing I hadn't let myself see. It wanted meat to sing right. It wanted that tension between give and hold. It wanted the small hot salt of life where the steel met the winter. I used the pipe like a lever and rolled the stay and tore myself free. The barb came with me. It anchored in the leather. It brought a hiss out of me that sounded like the first part of a word. I don't know what word. The recorder at my belt clicked twice like a small animal in a trap. The shapes brought their hands up and pressed their palms together, like bad students at prayer. The light increased. I took another half turn, the right way this time, and the cord lost that hungry edge. It changed to a carrying note that let a man breathe. The shapes stepped back. One by one, the droplets lifted from the barbs and moved along the strand and drained out toward the highway until there was only ice again. I cupped my hand to hold pressure and walked crooked to the bunkhouse. I kept thinking about Dale's girl with a fever and the way a father's shoulder smells like cottonseed and soap and a night of not sleeping. I kept thinking about the glove we had buried under the rock. I kept thinking the land had learned from us the wrong lesson. We had run lines and heard them sing and thought we were teaching the field to behave. The field had been listening and changing its song. Dale came at dawn and saw the blood on the snow and then saw me and then saw the cut in my glove and in my hand. He didn't touch me because some wounds don't want hands. He boiled water and poured coffee and let the radio murmur the farm report nobody believes but everyone needs. He told me something I didn't think was in him. He said his grandfather had strung parts of the frost line in 1919 with war wire, surplus stuff from France, wire that had been installed in places with names nobody could pronounce and cut from men nobody had met. He said the old man joked that it was haunted, and then said it wasn't a joke at all. He said that wire taught a wind to do things it hadn't done before. He said the wind is a fast learner. We cut that section that afternoon while the cattle were penned and the girls were in the house and the light was honest. We used bolt cutters that had taken bridges apart. We were careful. We wore new gloves we had not bled in. We rolled the wire in a coil that fought the way a snake with its head cut off fights. We laid it in the bed of his truck like a body. The posts looked naked and good in the sudden quiet. The sound didn't stop. It stepped to the next section and found its way around. We took the coil to a place north of town where people dump refrigerators and other things they don't want to admit to owning. We set it on a pile of broken sheet metal and stepped back and didn't say a word. The coil looked smaller there, ordinary, something a person who didn't know the tune might pick up and take to string tomatoes. The wind came up from the river. The barbs lifted and lay down. The coil made the smallest sigh. We left it without heroics and went home the long way. That night the hum changed again. The cattle didn't rest. The radio couldn't find a station that didn't sound like breath. The pump at the windmill turned once every 10 seconds, which is not a speed it knows. The recorder started by itself with the click I had begun to hate. I walked the line one more time with my hand wrapped and my mind more wrapped, and halfway to the brace, I saw Guevara's boy standing at his side of the fence with his crutches, sat in the snow and his shoulders hunched against the cold. He looked at me and then at the wire like he was in church and the preacher had called his name. Before I could tell him to go home, to get warm, to leave the line alone, he stepped forward and set one of his crutches into the diamonds, as if to see how steady the fence was, as if boys do not know yet the difference between a bridge and a trap. I moved. I dropped the pipe. I shouted his name even though I didn't know it. I did the thing any person would do who has ever felt responsible for anything else. I got between the boy and the line and took a barb in my coat again and shoved him back with my good hand and heard the spike of a new note that knocked the air out of me. The boy fell in the snow. His crutch went sideways. His eyes were bigger than I thought eyes could get. He crabbed away and then got to his feet and ran toward the dark house with the grace I hope he found again later in his life. Crutches beating. The ground in a rhythm I can still hear when I'm too tired to sleep. The shapes came out then full. Not the thin suggestions. Many. Coordinated. In a line of their own, facing our line. They made no gestures. They didn't reach. They stood the way men stand on a parade ground when they know exactly what they are promising, simply by being there. The wire between us sang a chord I have no words for because we have not made those words yet. It lifted and fell and found the right places inside me and the wrong places. It held for a long time, the way a person holds the breath that will make or break them, and then it released. The light went out. The shapes thinned. The wire fell quiet. The night took itself back. In the morning, an Angus bull lay where the boy had stood, laid so clean a butcher would have been proud and ashamed. There were no marks beyond the cut. There were no tracks beyond mine. There was a coin on the top barb at the brace, not worn, not old. One of the new ones with the shiny shield that looks like an idea more than a design. I took it and put it in my pocket, and I have never been without it since. It is warm even, when the rest of me is not. Sometimes I wake with my hand closed around it and a sound in my ear that isn't quite a sound, the way the sea lives in seashells and in the bones of sailors. We changed how we worked after that. Not because of any decision made in daylight, because some part of us knew our tuning wasn't keeping something out. It was keeping something in. When we made the cord sweet, the cattle slept, and the light came to the wire, and the shapes stood, with their hands at their sides, and there was no taking. When we made the cord wrong, the taking came fast and messy. We had been trying to starve a thing by turning its music sour. The better way, the way the land wanted, was not to starve it at all, but to feed it enough to keep it sated and still. That is not the kind of truth a person speaks in front of other men. That is a truth you carry like a hidden cut where the glove doesn't cover. Dale sold half the herd. He moved the rest to a south pasture where a creek bed and a grove of stubborn cottonwoods gave the sense of a different world. He ordered new wire that had never belonged to anyone but the catalog company, and to us. We strung it slow with hands that had learned to listen. We paid attention to the places the note liked, to become a voice. We taught the wind manners, and the wind taught us patience, and then forgot both. The season changed on us when we weren't watching, the way seasons do when you live by work instead of calendars. The wheat came in a shade too pale. The calves grew long in the legs and more skittish than good for them. We buried the dead as if burying didn't mean anything in soil that moves. We kept one another's eyes steady when they wanted to drop. I left in May. There wasn't a fight. There wasn't a last straw. There was a radio ad for a job down near San Angelo where the mesquite are shorter and the earth is redder and the fences don't sing the same song. I packed a truck and shook hands and smiled the way a man smiles when he's telling you he'll come by for coffee, and means it at the time. I drove south with the recorder in my toolbox and the coin in my pocket and 2 small coils of old wire, cut from the frost line like lockets of hair. I told myself I brought them because I am sentimental about the work that used me up and built me back. I told myself a lot of things that were not as true as the one thing I knew and could not admit. I was bringing the song with me. I live behind a chain-link fence now. The neighbors let their dogs yap against it at dusk, and the sun throws little squares on my wall in the afternoon. When the wind hits from the west after a heat storm, the fence makes a quiet sound that tells me I am not as far from anything as I want to believe. A boy down the street rides his bike with a plastic ring on the handlebar that is the same lime green as the one I found on a barb that night. Sometimes I see him stop and touch the fence with the back of his fingers, like testing the temperature of a skillet. Sometimes I sit on my steps and put my hand in my pocket and close my fingers around a coin that refuses to know cold. Sometimes I take out the recorder and play the tape I made by accident and listen to the breath at the end of it, and tell myself it is only my breath, and sometimes I believe myself. Not often. Last fall, a friend called from up near Borger and said he had found 2 heifers laid odd along his south line. He said he had heard a tone in his gait when he latched it, a little note that made his gut flutter, the way stepping off a curb you didn't see makes your gut flutter. He asked if I had ever heard that. I said wind is a trickster. I said frost can do things you don't expect. I said the kind of sentences a person says when he wants to keep a friend and also keep a secret that is not his alone to tell. He said, He understood, which told me a secret had already found him. I sleep with earplugs sometimes. It doesn't change anything. The hum doesn't need the ear. It wants the small bones. It wants the cup of your chest. It wants the places where you keep promises. I walk the perimeter of this little house like I walk the frost line, and sometimes I catch myself tightening the little bolts that hold my life together, giving them the quarter turn I learned on a barbed strand that had been tuned by weather and grief into a voice that knew my name. I can keep it quiet for a while. I can hold the cord in a way that lets me eat a meal without tasting metal. I can move through a day without counting the beats between breaths. But nights come back around, and winter comes back around. And once in a while I wake with my hand bleeding where there is no cut, and the sound of distant cattle calling to something they cannot see. If you drive the county roads past the frost place now, you will see what you expect to see. Posts and wire and sky. Windmills pacing a horizon that never learns its own limits. Wheat that fails and wheat that tries again. You will see knots in the wire where men with hands like yours have mended and mended again. You will see small ribbons of cloth that have bleached to off-white and move like breath on wash lines. If you stop and lay your palm on a post, you will feel only the good thrum of the plains, blood and grass and air. If you stand a little longer, you might hear the first note. It is a kind note, not cruel, a neighbor's voice at a fence when his hat is in his hands and he has come to tell you something he wishes he did not have to say. If you are smart, you will step back and get in your truck and keep driving. If you are like me, you will figure you can learn the tune and make it yours. The last time I went back, not long ago and longer than I want to admit, the wire looked ordinary in the hard noon light, the way a snake looks like a stick until it moves. I stood where the brace had been years ago and felt foolish and weak and relieved. I thought maybe age had calmed me and the land both. A pickup came along the county road and slowed, and a woman I didn't know leaned out and asked if I had seen the lights up here since they put in that new section last month. I said, "What lights?" She smiled like a person forced to admit her house is haunted if you bring it up, and she said, "The ones that stand along the fence and hum like the world is holding its breath." I said I had not, and she drove away a little too fast, as if to outrun the part of the conversation she had just decided never to have again. I waited until dusk. I told myself I was waiting to see the kind of postcard sunset people in other states think we get every night. The wind shifted through 4 points. The smell of cattle came and went like a skipped record. The note lifted in the wire and found the old place in my jaw. The first light came like a spark caught in steel wool, and then another, and then 5, and then a line of them, and the shape stepped out with all the patience of old things. I stood on the wrong side of the fence and put my hands in my pockets and felt the coin that never cools and listened to the tune that is not mine, but will always know me. It said my name in a way that wasn't a word but was a chord I could not mistake. I stayed until the light went out and the cold came up from the ground and the stars cut me, and then I got in my truck and drove south to the little house with chain link and a boy with crutches who had grown into a man with a limp and a family, and a way of standing at the edge of things as if the edge were his. I keep the pieces of wire in a jar in the garage. They are not mementos. They are proof. They do not sing, not on their own. They are quiet the way a loaded gun is quiet when it is in the drawer nobody opens. Sometimes I take them out and hold them against the fence at the back of the yard just to feel the smallest answering vibration, the recognition of one steal by another, the way dogs know cousins at a sniff. I never leave them there. I always put them back. I am not careless anymore. I am exactly the kind of careful that looks like superstition to men who have never pulled a line tight enough to hear it speak. It's late now. The wind has come up, off the flats with grit in it. The neighbors have taken their flags down because flags make the wrong sound in weather like this. The house is settling after heat, like old bones after a long service. I can hear my fence humming, low, polite, almost nothing. If I stand and go outside and put my palm on a post, I know I will feel it answer my heart, like a small calf answers its mother with a sigh you cannot hear unless you are touching both of them. I know the chord by now, the one that runs from the Canadian Breaks to the Caprock and across the red willows and the dry creeks and the places where men have put their dead in the ground and told themselves the line between here and there is an invention. The core doesn't care what we think of it. It holds. It waits. It asks if I remember. It asks if I have been keeping up with my tuning. It asks me to admit I will go back someday to the frost fence where the wire hums like a violin string, and the cattle find themselves laid against it as if sleep had been promised and instead they were taught a song. I will. Not because I am brave. Because I am a man who learned to hear the difference between a wall and a bow, and because something out there woke up to a music we gave it and found itself hungry for notes. We made an instrument out of a county. We made a throat out of wire. Every boundary is a mouth when the wind finds it. Every mouth needs feeding. When the air is right, when the frost comes down and the grass cracks under your boots and the stars look like nails in a lid, you will hear it too, even if you pretend you don't. You will hear your own name come down the line like a song you didn't know anybody remembered, and you will stand there longer than a wise man would, because wisdom is quiet and the wire is not, and because the wind runs unbroken across the panhandle and no one ever taught it to stop.